Chapter 547. The first day, the rain became heavier. The wind and clouds tumbled about in the sky. Lightning and thunder roared as they sliced through the sky. The clouds became thicker, and from the distance, it looked as if they were about to descend on the ground and crash into it. On that day, Su Ming tried breaking the rune 7 times in a row, but every single time, he could not surpass the changes in the rune. It was as if 2 mirrors were placed side by side, and all he could see was an endless darkness that spread to an unknown place. If he wanted to see the world in the mirror, then he had to rush out of that darkness. The third day, rain poured down like a torrential downpour. Tremors appeared on the ground of the world of Nine, and there were even some mountains that looked as if they were about to shatter into pieces. The clouds in the sky rotated slowly as they tumbled about. At first glance, it looked as if the entire sky had turned into a gigantic vortex. There were 99 pillars of light connecting the sky and the earth in the world of Nine. If anyone drew the entire world of Nine into a huge picture, then they would be able to clearly see that the 99 pillars of light were like beams of light that supported the vortex in the sky. During these 3 days, Su Ming tried a dozen something times to surpass the rune, but he still failed every single time. Yet even so, Su Ming had slowly figured out some of the patterns. The speed he used to break through the rune was his specialty, his speed. As he traveled at that speed, he gradually noticed that there were a few illusions that were distorting and disappearing. I need to continue traveling at high speed. On the third night, after Su Ming failed, he stood on the first altar and his eyes sparkled. The fifth day, more cracks appeared on the ground, and deep ravines tore through the ground of the world of Nine with loud bangs. It was as if the ground was about to collapse. As the ravines spread out in all directions, many mountains collapsed and shattered stones fell off. Many of them fell into the endless ravines. If anyone looked down from the sky, they would be able to see that the ground looked as if it was shattering, and the cracks were slowly spreading outwards. It was as if there was something that wanted to rush out from the ground. A large amount of rain poured into the ravines, and they would never be able to fill them up. The vortex in the clouds rotated even faster, and the loud rumbling sounds became an eternal sound in the world of Nine. Bolts of lightning continued flashing and rumbling in the depths of the vortex in the clouds in the sky, as if they wanted to blast the center of the vortex apart. Su Ming continued failing. By the end of the 5th day, he had already lost count of how many times he had failed, but even if he did not succeed even once, he could already make more than 100 illusions disappear rapidly. However, it was difficult for Su Ming to maintain this sort of speed for a long period of time. Because of it, he could not surpass all the changes brought about by the rune. The 7th day, at first glance, the vortex in the sky did not seem to be spinning anymore. That was because it was spinning too fast, so fast that it gave people the impression that it was just an illusion. As it spun rapidly, the booming sounds turned into shocking howls. As they echoed in the air, a gigantic human face slowly appeared in the vortex. The face had 4 eyes. The 2 extra eyes were at the center of its brows, and they were both closed. They protruded from the cloud vortex, and the center of the vortex was where the 4th eye was. This was the world spirit, and it was also the sleeping vessel spirit of the enchanted vessel from the Sacredine world that had turned into the world of Nine. Once the face appeared, the collapse of the ground reached its peak. Even the valley belonging to the fated kin had collapsed. Fortunately, the fated kin had been prepared for this since a long time ago. At that moment, they gathered together, and under Nan Gonghen's lead, they waited for Su Ming's return outside the altar. When Su Ming was prepared to challenge the rune on the altar, he had spread his divine sense outwards and told Nan Gonghen the exact time when the world would change and where he would go. From the 5th day onwards, Su Ming sat down on the first altar. He did not try to challenge it again, but chose to meditate quietly instead. Even when the 7th day passed, he still remained the same. The 9th day, when this day arrived, most of the ground had sunk in. The hundreds of fated kin, led by Nan Gonghen, had also retreated to the edge of the altar. They could see Su Ming sitting on the altar not too far away from them. And they could also see that the valley they had stayed in for 15 years had completely collapsed and disappeared without a trace. They could also see that the spot 100 feet away from them, near the collapsed valley, had turned into a ravine. It was as if they were standing on a lone cliff. The eyes of the gigantic human face that had appeared in the vortex in the sky were trembling at that moment, as if it was slowly waking up from a deep slumber. The two eyes at the center of its brows were also trembling furiously, as if they were about to open at any moment. The 99 pillars of light also seemed to have reached their limit. 7 of them were rapidly fading away before eventually disappearing. Once they disappeared, another dozen-something pillars of light faded away as well, as if they could no longer hold on and gradually faded away. Su Ming continued, sitting cross-legged on the altar, unmoving. He had been like this for the past few days, but even though he did not move, the fated kin who had been paying attention to him had gradually noticed that Su Ming's presence was becoming stronger with each passing day. His qi was growing stronger with every passing moment, and it was especially so on the 9th day. Distortion started appearing in the air around Su Ming, as if it could no longer withstand the power he was accumulating in his body. His body had still been shining with golden light a few days ago, but at that moment, that golden light was fading away. It did not disappear, but was instead absorbed by Su Ming, preventing that golden light from spilling out. As the hundreds of fated kin and Nan Gonghen watched intently, time gradually passed by. When the 9th day passed, the 10th day arrived. Not long after the 10th day arrived, the eyes of the gigantic human face in the sky trembled even more furiously. The clouds rumbled and moved about, and even the spot where the altar was started trembling, as if it could no longer hold on. Cracks started appearing on the altar. At a spot in the sky that the crowd could not see, a person in yellow robes appeared. He stood in midair and formed a seal with his hands before he pointed towards the sky. Spirit of the enchanted vessel, as the elder of the spirits of 9 Een awaken. The human face in the sky trembled even more furiously, but it still could not open its eyes. It was as if there was a power within its soul that made it difficult for it to wake up. At that moment, the pillars of light in the world of 9 Een were rapidly disappearing. There were only 27 of them left, and they were rapidly fading away. Once all these pillars of light disappeared and the world spirit still did not wake up, then everything they had done this time would end in failure. As the pillars of light disappeared and the altar started crumbling, the rune formed by the altar also started weakening. Once the final wisp of golden light around Su Ming's body was completely absorbed into his body, he opened his eyes swiftly. There was a profound look in his eyes, and not a single hint of golden light could be seen within them. Su Ming had been accumulating his power for several days, and during these few days, he had not paid any attention to the world around him. He had placed all his attention on gathering up his power, and the instant he opened his eyes, he charged forward at an indescribable speed. This was the fastest speed Su Ming had executed during the past 10 days. Almost the instant Su Ming rushed out of the altar, an innumerable amount of altars appeared before him, along with an innumerable amount of himself charging forward. However, the moment these illusions appeared, several dozens of them immediately distorted and disappeared. Clearly, they could not keep up with Su Ming's speed and were overtaken by him. Everything in Su Ming's eyes disappeared at that moment. The only thing that remained was the endless path to the altar that was like a black hole before him. He forgot everything and executed his strongest speed to charge forward. The illusions disappeared around him, and after a moment, a total of 100 of them disappeared, but there were still an endless amount of them before Su Ming. Nearly 100 illusions had disappeared. This was Su Ming's limit a few days ago, but it was not his limit now. All the power in his bones sacrifice realm erupted forth, and his speed became slightly faster. As he charged forward, he left behind a trail of afterimages, but as they appeared, a large number of illusions disappeared as well. Su Ming did not know how much time had passed. He only knew that as he continued charging forward, time seemed to have slowed down. A large number of illusions disappeared, but there were still quite a large number of them before him. When he circulated his cultivation base, he felt intense pain all over his body. This was a sign that he had surpassed what he could bear. However, there were still a dozen-something of his illusions far ahead of him. He had surpassed most of them, but it was still difficult for him to surpass all of them. Is this it? Su Ming felt anguished. He knew that even if he turned into destiny, it would still be difficult for him to surpass all of them within 15 breaths. Yet the instant he felt anguished in his heart, as the sky suddenly roared and the ground trembled, cracks suddenly appeared on the first altar that truly existed in this place. This was the creation of the world, the awakening of the world's spirit. Yet almost the instant the cracks appeared on the altar, Su Ming immediately noticed that the dozen-something illusions of himself before him froze at the same time. That momentary pause caused the strongest light to shine in Su Ming's eyes. Without a hint of hesitation, he turned into a vortex as he continued charging forward, and the one who rushed out of that vortex was Destiny's teenage self. With that one step, he made the dozen-something illusions freeze in that state for an eternity. They continued freezing and retreating, and when 15 breaths passed by, the teenage Destiny turned back into Su Ming, and he appeared less than 5 feet away from the dozen-something illusions. However, even if it was only 5 feet, he had already surpassed all the changes in the rune. He felt as if his entire body had crashed into a membrane. That membrane stopped his body from moving through, but it could not stop Su Ming from looking at it with his eyes wide open. He saw, almost the instant Su Ming saw the world in the mirror, the old man in yellow robes spread his arms wide open in the sky above the world of Nine. When there were only 3 pillars of light left, a low roar came from the sunken ground. World Spirit awakened. Along with that muffled roar was an arm made of withered wood rising from the canyons in the sunken ground. Behind that arm was a gigantic head made of withered wood, along with a gigantic figure that was 10,000 feet tall. It was a person made of withered wood that looked like a tree that was 10,000 feet tall. That head was the one that hung in Shaman City in the past, and that body was the real body of the old man in yellow robes from the spirits of Nine. The instant that roar shook the sky, the 3 remaining pillars of light were extinguished. Yet right at the instant they were extinguished, the gigantic human face in the vortex in the sky opened its 3rd and 4th eyes at the center of its brows at the same time. The world spirit had awakened. Blackout, blackout, blackout. I can't fix it today, and I'm so frustrated that I'm about to explode. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Achidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 548. The instant the world spirit woke up, the few remaining regions in the world of Nine started trembling and slowly disappearing, as if they had never existed in the first place. When they disappeared, even the altar where Su Ming and the fated kin were was the same. The ground before the hundreds of fated kin started disappearing inch by inch, as if there was a gigantic mouth that could not be seen devouring the ground, causing the fated kin to rise into the air and look in Su Ming's direction. However, they could no longer see Su Ming. They could only see that the spot where Su Ming had been previously was now a blur, and there was also a strong feeling that it was distorting and tearing their vision apart. The sky rumbled, and the human face that protruded out from the gigantic vortex opened its eyes at that moment. Light shone in all directions, and the gigantic body of the withered tree charged towards the human face, as if it wanted to fuse with it. As for Su Ming, once he surpassed all the illusions created by the rune with that extreme speed, he sensed a layer of membrane on the rune. It blocked his body, but could not block his gaze. His gaze pierced through that invisible membrane, and he saw an endless black ocean. That ocean was boundless, and there were 5 gigantic continents floating on it. The eastern and southern continents of these 5 continents were incredibly close to each other, and if anyone did not look closely, they would think that they were connected to each other. However, if anyone took a closer look, they would find that they were not connected to each other. It was clear that the eastern continent was crashing into the southern continent at an incredible speed. The world in the mirror. A bang went off in Su Ming's head. He seemed to have come to understand something, and his gaze swiftly turned towards the west, towards the continent in the west. However, he could not see the details of that continent clearly. He could only see its outline, and then a huge force shot out from the membrane around his body and instantly bounced him off. Almost at the instant Su Ming was bounced back, the membrane shattered, and the altar at the center of the rune also shattered along with it. Su Ming took a few steps backwards, and with each step he took, his body would be revealed from that extreme speed. When he took his 10th step, his body appeared clearly before the fated kin's eyes once again. It was also at this moment that the human face in the vortex in the sky finished fusing with the withered tree. The moment they fused, the vortex exploded with a bang, turning into a powerful shockwave that swept out in all directions. That wave of air was so strong that it looked as if it had turned into a violent gust of wind. As it charged forward, it spread out in a circle, and it was so quick that in the span of a few breaths, it covered the area where the fated kin were. If they allowed it to sweep through the area, then there would be a large number of fated kin who would be swept away and destroyed like autumn leaves. The expressions of the hundreds of fated kin changed drastically. Nan Gonghen took a few steps forward without any hesitation and stood before his people. Some of the fated kin who had higher levels of cultivation also gritted their teeth and charged forward, intending to fight against the incoming shockwave and protect their people's safety. Almost the instant these people moved to fight against the shockwave charged towards them with a loud bang. The moment it touched them, Nan Gonghen coughed out a mouthful of blood, and he felt as if a mountain had crashed into his face. The other fated kin beside him not only coughed up blood, they also felt as if their bodies were about to be torn apart. They fell backwards against their will, but behind them were the fated kin. Some of these fated kin were even children. They could not fly on their own and had to be carried by their people. If they came into contact with that shockwave, they would definitely die. Nan Gonghen's eyes were bloodshot. He wanted to fight against the shockwave, but he could not control his body. He continued retreating, and just as the shockwave was about to drown the fated kin within it, a white figure suddenly appeared before Nan Gonghen and all the fated kin. That person was dressed in white, and he was naturally Su Ming. At that moment, he forced down the shock he felt when he saw the world in the mirror and lifted his right hand to push against the incoming shockwave. As he did so, golden light spread out from his entire body and enveloped the hundreds of fated kin behind him to fight against that shocking shockwave. In just the span of 3 breaths, Su Ming found himself unable to withstand it. He might have extraordinary power, and most of his flesh, blood, and bones had turned into berserker bones, and his physical body was incredibly strong, but it was still difficult for him to last long under that shockwave. In truth, the reason why he could last until now was because of the strength of his physical body. If it was anyone else, they would have been injured and forced back the instant they came into contact with the shockwave, just like Nan Gonghen. Fortunately, that vast shockwave was sweeping through the area and not targeting Su Ming. That was why after Su Ming persevered for the span of 3 breaths, the shockwave swept past the area where they were. Even though Su Ming and the fated kin he was protecting were swept back several thousands of feet like a lone boat swept by a raging wave, none of them died. Once the shockwave swept past them, everything returned to normal. Su Ming panted harshly. The golden light on his body did not disappear. Instead, he lifted his head and looked towards the sky in the distance, at the gigantic face that had fused with the body of the dead tree once the vortex collapsed. The 4 eyes on the face also looked towards Su Ming at the same time. Su Ming looked over. The middle section of the 4th eye is where the rune is. I will never forget your help. An ancient voice reverberated in the world and fused together with the booming sounds. Soon after, The gigantic face before Su Ming's eyes swelled up with a shudder. In the blink of an eye, it grew 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times bigger. Not only did it replace the sky, the vast expanse of the sky disappeared, replaced by a layer of bronze light. This feeling made it seem as if the sky had been covered by a veil previously. That veil was the color of the sky. That was why when Su Ming looked at it, the vast expanse of the sky was revealed. Yet now, as the face spread out, the veil looked as if it had been lifted, revealing its true color. The sky was not the sky. As the bronze light shone, the entire sky looked like the surface of a gigantic, enchanted vessel. There was a simple and ancient air to it. In fact, Su Ming could even see that the sky had turned into a gigantic piece of metal as the bronze hue appeared in the sky, and there were countless small holes densely packed together on it. There were even a lot of complicated runic symbols flashing on it. Su Ming might have been somewhat prepared for this, but when he saw it, he was still shocked. If he was reacting this way, then it was even more so for Nan Gong Hen and the other fated kin. Their shock could be clearly seen from the quickened breathing of the fated kin. What is this? By the looks of it, it looks like some sort of enchanted vessel. This is the true sky of the world of Ninein? Could it be that the sky before was fake, the ground was also an illusion, and only the sky now is real? Once they recovered from their shock, buzzing sounds came from the hundreds of people. They could not believe what they were seeing. As the veil was lifted from the sky and a large part of the bronze sky was revealed, another 9 gigantic runic symbols in the shape of the moon caught Su Ming's attention. Those 9 runic symbols surpassed all the other runic symbols and shone on the surface of the bronze enchanted vessel. When Su Ming looked at them, he was reminded of the 9 moons in the world of Ninein. Just as Su Ming's pupils shrank and his heart was shaken by the changes in the world of Ninein, the fourth eye at the center of the brows of the continuously expanding human face suddenly overlapped with a certain spot on the bronze sky. At the instant they overlapped with each other, booming sounds immediately came from that spot. It was as if the sky was moving and a gap had been opened up. Light spilled out from that gap. It might not be big, but it exuded a feeling of decay. It was right above Su Ming, as if it had been intentionally opened up in that place. With my power, I can only delay it for 10 breaths. Hurry up and enter. The old spirit of Nine Yin's ancient voice instantly reverberated in the air. The moment his voice traveled outwards, the gigantic swollen human face froze for a moment, as if it was forcefully stopped from spreading out, causing the gap formed when the fourth eye overlapped with the bronze sky to not disappear. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he charged into the sky. The fated kin behind him also charged forward, but they were too slow and could not compare to Su Ming. That was why when Su Ming took a step forward, golden light shone once again on his entire body, sweeping up the hundreds of fated kin behind him and charging into the sky with a loud whistle. The gap that had been opened specifically for Su Ming was continuously flashing. Its appearance was due to the human face overlapping with the bronze sky, and it should have instantly disappeared once they overlapped with each other, but the old spirit of Nine Yin forcefully stopped it. This sort of stopping was akin to making the enchanted vessel that could move through true worlds freeze while it was in operation. The difficulty of doing this was incredibly high, and with the old spirit of Nine Yin's abilities, he could at most last for 10 breaths. Su Ming led the fated kin forward, and from the distance, they looked like a golden shooting star charging towards the sky. They were getting closer, and by the 4th breath, they had already closed in on the bronze sky's gap. Yet at that moment, the gap started trembling even more violently. Booming sounds reverberated in the air, and Su Ming could clearly see that the human face that had originally been frozen in place was starting to move slowly. In less than 10 breaths. Hurry, I can't last any longer. The old spirit of Nine Yin's voice rang out anxiously. When he saw that the gap was about to close up due to the world spirit's movement, the golden light around Su Ming's body increased exponentially once again. All the fated kin behind him also erupted forth with their fastest speed and charged towards the gap with a loud whistle. When the world spirit returned to its normal state and swept through the gap, the instant it disappeared, Su Ming rushed into the gap. Most of the fated kin also rushed in with him. However, there were still 9 fated kin who did not manage to step into the gap in time. Once the gap closed up, they were isolated outside. Among these 9 people was the boy who had taken care of Time Mu for many years and had lost his right arm when he met Su Ming when he was still a child. With a bang, the gap closed up. Su Ming and the fated kin who had stepped into the gap would no longer know what would happen in the world outside. They were currently in a gigantic tunnel. To be continued. If you like this work, please comment. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 549. Su Ming swept his gaze across the area. The tunnel was dark, and the walls around them were not made of mud or stone, but bronze and iron. Runic symbols would appear every few inches between them. Those shining runic symbols became the only light in the place. The hundreds of fated kin were all silent at that moment, and there was a hint of grief on their faces. They had lived together for 15 years without a future. They might have a chance to leave now, but there were 9 members of their tribe who were eternally separated from them. Perhaps what awaited these 9 members of their tribe was death, but even if that was not the case, they would still be forever separated from them. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he averted his gaze from observing the area. He took a step forward and walked right in front of the group. As he charged forward, the fated kin behind him followed one after another. No one spoke along the way. Occasionally, some of the fated kin would lift their heads, and when their gazes fell on Su Ming's back right in front of them, for some unknown reason, their hearts slowly calmed down. Su Ming had brought 2 miracles to them. The first time was when they had fallen into despair while the sacred bats were slaughtering them. And the second time was when Su Ming had brought the future they had thought they could not leave for the past 15 years. They believed that there would be a third time, and the third time would be when respected senior M.O., who possessed the fated kin's cultivation method, brought them completely out of the world of Nine Een and back to the land of South Morning. It was not just 1 or 2 fated kin who thought this way. All the fated kin felt the same way at that moment. It could be said that Su Ming was their spiritual hope, and that feeling grew stronger with every single thing that happened. Su Ming walked in front and spread his divine sense outwards, but he could not spread it too far in this place. The walls around him had a strong repelling force that prevented his divine sense from spreading out. As he moved forward, Su Ming's footsteps came to a halt not too far away from the tunnel. There was a fork in this place, and there were 3 paths leading to it, making it difficult for anyone to tell which one would lead to the relocation rune. Once Su Ming stopped, the fated kin also stopped and looked at their surroundings in silence. Nan Gonghen took a few steps forward and stood beside Su Ming. Once he looked around, his gaze fell on Su Ming. He was not the only one. All the fated kin in the area looked towards Su Ming. Su Ming frowned. The old spirit of Nine Een did not say that there would be a fork in this place. He knew that he could not take the wrong path in these 3 paths. If he did, then he would lose precious time. Almost at the instant Su Ming and the others arrived at the fork and looked towards the 3 paths, the entire tunnel suddenly shuddered. It swayed so violently that they almost lost their footing. Muffled rumbling sounds came from outside, as if the passageway was about to collapse. The runes in the surroundings were flashing more and more frequently. The flashing of the runes would cause anyone who stayed here for a long time to feel irritated. Su Ming took a few steps forward, and right before the fated kin's gazes, he did not immediately make his choice. Instead, he sat down cross-legged on the ground and closed his eyes. His divine sense swiftly spread outwards, turning into 3 wisps that swiftly spread towards the 3 paths. As his divine sense spread out, it was continuously rejected by the land, and his divine sense was continuously weakened. Before it could spread out 1,000 feet, there was only a sliver of it left. Just as it was about to completely disappear, Su Ming's nascent divinity left his body and fused into his divine sense. Because of that, his divine sense increased exponentially once again. As it continued spreading outwards, The divine sense in the tunnel, right before him, became incredibly strange. It did not make a single sound, and even Su Ming did not have time to notice it before it immediately disappeared. The instant the divine sense in front of him disappeared, Su Ming saw a gigantic relocation rune on the path to his left. That rune was operating slowly at that moment, as if it could be activated at any moment. Su Ming's eyes flew open. He did not have time to bother about why the divine sense in front of him had disappeared. Just as he was about to retrieve the divine sense in the path to his right, a shudder suddenly ran through his body, and he turned his head around swiftly to stare at the path to his right. His pupils shrank, and a brilliant light shone in his eyes. All of this was because once the divine sense in the path to his right had spread out to 10,000 feet, he saw a gigantic space. He saw gigantic bubbles in that space. Many of those bubbles had burst, but they did not disappear. In fact, there were even some bubbles that did not shatter and remained in an incredibly complete state. Su Ming's breathing quickened. With gritted teeth, he retrieved his divine sense and no longer looked at the tunnel to his right. Instead, he stood up and led the fated kin following him to charge towards the tunnel to his left where he had sensed the rune. As the crowd moved swiftly, the tremors in the place became even more frequent. Booming sounds traveled forth, and the entire tunnel trembled viciously. In fact, cracks even appeared on the ground. As those cracks appeared, powerful light shone through, giving people a feeling that the ground in the tunnel was about to shatter at any moment. The runic symbols on the walls were also shining brightly. The light illuminated the entire area, causing the tunnel to look as bright as day at that moment. As everyone charged forward, it did not take long for an empty space to appear before them. There were also fine cracks on the ground, and at the same time, there was a huge rune that was operating with loud rumbles. That rune let out a feeling as if it was a relocation rune. At that moment, it was completely activated, and the moment they stepped in, they would be instantly relocated. Almost at the instant the crowd saw the rune and excitement appeared on their faces, the tunnel suddenly shuddered violently. It was as if the tunnel that had originally been lying horizontally had suddenly turned vertical, causing the fated kin to be unable to help themselves from moving backwards. They even looked as if they were about to fall. This is a dangerous moment. We will step into the rune with all our might. It doesn't matter where we'll be relocated to. If we're in the land of South Morning, if we're split up, remember this: we are fated kin. We are no longer shamans. Sky River Mountain in South Morning is our gathering place. If Sky River Mountain is no longer there, I will wait for you nearby. Let us fated kin shout out our names in the land of South Morning. Remember, Sky River Mountain. Remember, the one we worship is respected Senior M.O. Nan Gong Hen shouted. His voice reverberated in the air and rushed into the ears of all the fated kin, turning into determination and determination in their eyes. Everyone, we will meet again in South Morning. Su Ming floated up and wrapped his fist in his palm towards the fated kin in the vertical tunnel. We fated kin will worship respected Senior M.O. forever. We will meet again in South Morning. The fated kin's voices reverberated in the air, and people charged towards the relocation rune. Once they stepped in, they instantly disappeared. The tremors in the tunnel became even more intense. In fact, some of the spots in the distance had already started collapsing. The people charged forward, and almost every single fated kin could not help but stop for a moment when they passed by Su Ming. They would call him respected Senior M.O., wrap their fists in their palms, and bow towards him before stepping into the rune. The way they addressed him as respected Senior M.O. showed their determination. Perhaps this was no longer just a form of address, but had truly become a symbol in their hearts, along with the disappointment they felt towards the shamans after waiting for 15 years without any results. At that moment, once they addressed him as respected Senior M.O., all of this turned into an eternity and turned into the hot-bloodedness of being a fated kin. The way they called out to meet again in South Morning was not a joke, but a roar that came from the bottom of their hearts. After a moment, besides Nan Gong Hen, All the fated kin had bid their farewells and stepped into the ruin, disappearing without a trace. Nan Gonghen looked at Su Ming and wrapped his fist in his palm quietly, as if he wanted to say something, but he did not. Instead, he turned around and walked towards the relocation rune. The moment the rune shone and his body was about to disappear, he suddenly looked towards Su Ming. The words of the fated kin are not joking, and neither are my words. No matter how much changes happen in the world outside, we fated kin will never forget your kindness, respected Senior Mo. We will worship you for generations to come. Nan Gonghen's words reverberated in the air, and he disappeared into the rune. At that moment, the rune was still operating. Su Ming stood there, and the tremors in the tunnel became even more intense. He looked at the rune, then suddenly turned around. He did not step into the rune, but instead walked down the tunnel and went back the way he came. If he left just like that, then he would be unwilling to accept it. If he left just like that, then he would have too many questions that he did not have answers to. The old spirit of Nine Yin had once said that if Su Ming had enough courage and could persevere until the end, then with the courage to say that he might never be able to leave, then he would be able to see the real world. This was something Su Ming still remembered, and he wanted to see it. Also, the things he saw with his divine sense in the tunnel to the right had made his heart tremble. For some unknown reason, he felt a sense of familiarity from that place. That familiarity was very faint. If he searched for it carefully, it would be difficult for him to notice it. Only when he was not paying attention would he feel a sense of déjà vu. That feeling had appeared for an instant when Su Ming used his divine sense to investigate the tunnel to the right. He did not know what that feeling was. Neither did he know whether there were other people in the world who would also have that feeling of déjà vu when they came to the same place, saw the same thing, or did the same thing by chance. Su Ming charged forward and moved through the tunnel in the span of a breath. He shot through several collapsed paths and arrived at the junction. Without a hint of hesitation, he charged towards the tunnel to the right. The tunnel to the right had also become vertical. Su Ming looked as if he was walking through a tunnel with stone pillars as he charged upwards. The runic symbols in the tunnel were bright and no longer shining. More cracks appeared around him, and strong light seeped through them. At the end of the tunnel, which was the edge of the empty land that Su Ming had seen with his divine sense previously, there were even more cracks on the walls. There was even one crack that was as wide as a fist. The instant Su Ming stepped into the empty land, he first swept his gaze past the crack and saw a thick layer of fog that was shining with a brilliant light beyond the crack. There were also waves of chilling air coming from the crack along with the strong light. At the same time, the tunnel trembled violently once again. A piercing whistle came from outside, and, as it trembled, Su Ming had a feeling that the tunnel and the bronze sky, where it was moving rapidly. His breathing froze for a moment. He stepped into the empty land and saw everything that he had seen with his divine sense just now. There's still one more chapter to go. Just a little more recommendation votes, and you'll be in second place? What are you waiting for? My fellow Taoists, grab your weapons and attack. To be continued. If you like this work, please come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 550. This was a gigantic empty land, and in the distance was the entrance to a tunnel that stretched even further into the distance. There were nearly 100 bubbles floating in midair in that empty space. Most of these bubbles had already burst, but they did not disappear. Instead, they were like eggshells. Some of them might have cracked, but their bodies were still intact. As Su Ming looked at these bubbles, he slowly walked past them in silence, until a complete bubble appeared before him. That bubble was 30 feet tall, and it floated in midair, unmoving. Within it was a middle-aged man with scales growing on his chest. His eyes were closed, and there was a bloody hole at the center of his brows. That was the injury that had caused his death. This was a corpse, one that had been dead for an unknown number of years, and one that had lived for an unknown number of years. Su Ming looked at the bubble before him, and when he walked past it, he saw another complete bubble. There was still a corpse inside. It was a woman, and she had black wings on her back. She had an incredibly beautiful face, and at that moment, she looked incredibly serene. Su Ming saw veins forming a ferocious face of a ghost on her body. Perhaps this was the reason for her death. There were nearly 100 bubbles in this place, and only 8 of them were undamaged, and within them were corpses. We spirits of 9 left true, sacred world by the will of the true spirit of true, sacred world to head to the other 3 great true worlds in search of the corpses of the powerful warriors. The old spirit of 9 Yin's words echoed in Su Ming's head at that moment. He walked past the empty land and charged down the entrance to the tunnel. After a moment, as the tunnel continued trembling, another empty land appeared before him. There were less than 50 bubbles in this place. 4 of them were undamaged, and the rest had all shattered. As Su Ming walked forward, he walked past one such empty land after another. He had already gained an understanding of the structure of this place. The tunnel was like a tube, and there were quite a number of bumps within it. Each of those bumps was an empty land like this. In the 7th empty region, Su Ming saw a gigantic bubble floating at the center. That bubble might have been broken, but when Su Ming looked at it, he felt as if there was no end to it. Perhaps this was just a figment of his imagination, but there was also a possibility that this bubble could form its own dimension. Su Ming trembled slightly at the edge of the bubble. He could sense the presence of the candle dragon. Our people's mission is to search for the corpses of powerful existences in the universe. The old man's voice appeared in Su Ming's mind once again. He looked at the gigantic bubble before him and came to an understanding. This was originally the place where the candle dragon's carcass was placed. Due to the enchanted vessel being damaged, many of the bubbles burst. Su Ming mumbled. He looked around him, and that familiar feeling appeared once again. In silence, Su Ming charged forward once again. He moved down the tunnel and arrived at the 8th empty spot. There he saw 3 bubbles. These 3 bubbles were all incomparably huge. At this moment, all of them were broken. It was unknown what was contained within them in the past. When Su Ming arrived at the 9th empty spot, it was the final spot because there were no other entrances to the tunnels around it. This was the end of the tunnel. There was only one bubble here. It was the smallest bubble among all the bubbles Su Ming had seen in all the empty spaces he walked through. It was only the size of a person's arm. If there was a corpse contained within, then it could only be a baby. It was a pity that the bubble had already burst. It was empty inside. It floated quietly in that gigantic, empty space, unmoving. As Su Ming looked at the bubble, he was stunned and forgot about everything else. Even if the place was trembling so violently that it was about to collapse, he no longer paid any attention to it. His life and all his gaze were only focused on that small bubble. Tears fell from his eyes at some unknown point of time. He walked slowly to the bubble and stretched out his right hand to gently caress its surface. After a long while, Su Ming lifted his head and cast a deep look at the bubble, then turned around and ran back the way he had come from. He did not show any reluctance to leave. Neither did he show any signs of stopping. His back was resolute, and there was loneliness and grief in it. In an instant, he disappeared into the tunnel, leaving behind only that bubble. No one knew how many years it had existed in this place, but it would continue existing in this place. Su Ming had tried to open the bubbles that were still in perfect condition, but with his level of cultivation, he could not move them in the slightest. At that moment, he left. He no longer looked at the bubbles. As he charged forward, once the tunnel finally started collapsing, he charged forward. Behind him, the tunnels collapsed one by one, burying the dimensions and everything in them. Before him, the collapse of the tunnel continued, causing Su Ming to be unable to help himself but increase his speed. Roars came from the center of the tunnel as it collapsed. There was a hint of madness in those roars, and they reverberated in the air. More cracks appeared in the tunnel to the right, and at that moment, it completely collapsed with a bang, revealing the endless fog in the world outside. That fog was swiftly moving backwards, causing all those who saw it to feel as if they were hallucinating. They could not tell whether the fog was moving or the bronze sky was moving. Yet the instant it crumbled, a person rushed out. Su Ming did not stop. Even if he heard the roars coming from the tunnel in the center, he did not even spare a glance. In a flash, he charged towards the tunnel with the relocation rune. Once Su Ming left, the tunnel in the center completely collapsed and disappeared, revealing the thick fog tumbling about. As the collapse spread out, a large portion of the tunnel to the left also disappeared. That disappearing force was similar to the world of Nine in disappearing. It was as if there was a ghastly, invisible mouth that was continuously devouring it. Su Ming charged forward, and after a moment, he came to a halt. Before him, the tunnel was collapsing, cutting off his path to the relocation rune. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. Once he came to a halt, he took a swift step forward. He looked as if he had stepped into the fog. A gigantic suction force swept up his body, and a freezing chill also came crashing down on him, as if it wanted to drag him into the darkness of the fog. Golden light shone on Su Ming's entire body. Banging sounds reverberated within his body, and the instant the suction force swept up his body, he turned into a long arc and shot through the collapsing tunnel before him. Once he shot through the collapsing tunnel, Su Ming's breathing quickened. His face was pale, but he did not stop moving. He continued charging forward, and finally, as the tunnel continued shattering behind him, he arrived at the place where the relocation rune was. There were even more cracks there, causing the rune to look as if it was about to be torn apart. The light on it had also become much dimmer. If the light was completely extinguished, then the rune would no longer be able to function, and it would be impossible for Su Ming to leave. At that moment, if he stepped into the rune, he could still be relocated, but Su Ming stood at the edge of the rune. A resolute look appeared in his eyes, and he did not step into it. He turned around and looked at the completely collapsed tunnel behind him. He looked at the rolling fog before him, and he swiftly spread his divine sense outwards. This spreading out was the complete eruption of his nascent divinity. He wanted to see everything at that instant. As he spread his divine sense outwards, he saw an endless amount of fog. Shrill screams could be heard within that fog, but besides that, he could not see anything else. However, he could sense that the place where he was moving swiftly, moving through the fog. After a moment, the instant everything besides the rune around Su Ming crumbled, he immediately noticed that the large amount of fog he could see with his divine sense had started tumbling about even more furiously. As it tumbled about, he saw the fog turning into a gigantic vortex. A powerful ray of light shot out from the center of the vortex, and as it did so, a gigantic ancient bronze sword that looked like a shuttle and shone with a bronze light came out. Its end could not be seen. It was an incredibly large bronze sword. That sword executed an indescribable speed and looked as if it was struggling to break free from the vortex of fog. The light on its body shone brilliantly, and gradually it flew out of the fog with a bang. At the instant it flew out, a black fog claw went to seize it, but it did not manage to catch it. The gigantic ancient bronze sword that looked like a shuttle charged out of the fog and broke free from the vortex. It was also during that instant that Su Ming could clearly sense his existence. He was within the ancient bronze sword that had shot out of the fog. This thing was clearly the enchanted vessel from the sacred Yin world that could move through true worlds. The relocation rune behind Su Ming became even duller at that moment, as if all the power that was supporting its operation was being sucked away by the gigantic ancient bronze sword. Just a little more. Just a little more. Su Ming mumbled. His eyes were bloodshot, and he spread his divine sense outwards in a large area. He saw the gigantic ancient bronze sword leaving the fog vortex, and he also saw the entirety of the fog as it continued flying into the distance. This was a vast starry sky. It was a vortex of fog that kept spinning in the starry sky. As it spun and the ancient bronze sword moved into the distance, the fog slowly dissipated. It was as if a black hole had been opened and was slowly closing. At the same time, Su Ming's appearance slowly changed. A thick wave of aura of death appeared around his body, as if it had always existed, but the Su Ming in the past could not see it, could not sense it. Su Ming trembled. He did not care about that aura of death, because he saw the dazzling stars in the vast galaxy, and there were a few long arcs that could be vaguely seen moving through them. There were clearly people within those long arcs, and they were dressed in gorgeous robes. At that moment, they stopped where they were. Su Ming could not see their faces, but he knew that they must have been shocked by the sight of the gigantic ancient bronze sword. Su Ming saw the galaxy. He saw round planets, and he also saw continents floating in the galaxy. I see. So that's how it is? Su Ming mumbled. His body became weaker, as if this was not a forbidden zone for life that he could enter at that moment. He staggered backwards, and the instant the light from the rune disappeared, he stepped into it. This place does not belong to you. I will send you back to where you belong, but I believe that one day you will walk out from the other side of the mirror with your own strength. The old spirit of Nine Yin's voice echoed in the air, and there was a hint of reluctance in his voice as he bid farewell. Su Ming's body gradually disappeared, but right at the instant he completely disappeared, he suddenly spoke. Your tribe was ordered to search for corpses in the past. Did you find a dead baby? You. A hint of shock suddenly appeared in the old spirit of Nine Yin's calm voice. He seemed to have remembered something, and his voice turned into a gasp of shock. Before Su Ming disappeared, a brilliant light shone in his eyes. True sacred Yin world, spirit of Nine Yin, I will go and find you. I've finally written this chapter. In my plan, 500 chapters is a milestone, and this chapter is supposed to be the 500th chapter. Right now, it's 507, 20,000 more than I planned. But since I'm planning to write 1,500,000 words, 20,000 more than I planned is understandable. I'm confident that I can activate the second milestone later on. I'm very confident. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 551. Clouds tumbled about outside sky Mist City in the land of South Morning. Thunder rumbled in the sky, and rain poured down. The appearance of this rain was strange. It had fallen on the ground several months ago, and it had not stopped since then. Everything in the world looked indistinct in the rain, causing people to be unable to see too far into the distance. As the rain fell, a humid stench of the sea spread out in all directions. The towering sky Mist City in the past was now in dead silence. Not a single sound could be heard, but if anyone took a closer look, they would find that it was slightly different from before. The walls of the mountain range had become much taller. If anyone lifted their heads from the city, they would be able to sense this clearly. If anyone cast their eyes over the land of the shamans beyond sky Mist City, they would find that there was not a single soul on the land of the shamans. If anyone looked down from the highest point in the sky and looked down at the entire land of South Morning, then they would find that at the edge of the land of the shamans, there were raging waves surging into the sky. The vast amount of seawater was continuously submerging the land, and by the looks of it, before long, it would reach Sky Mist City. Further away from the seawater was the dead sea shrouded in rain. There was a gigantic piece of land approaching the land of the shamans. It might have seemed slow, but in truth, if anyone got close to it, they would be able to tell that it was traveling at an incredibly fast speed. That dark continent was the Eastern Wastelands. As it approached, violent gusts of wind howled and the seawater roared. It also filled the land of the shamans, drowning all the mountains at the edge and turning a large amount of plains into an endless sea. The catastrophe of the Eastern Wastelands was going on furiously. Before long, when the Eastern Wastelands crashed into the land of South Morning, the disaster would fully unfold for the people in the land of South Morning. The mountains would crumble, the earth would crack, the mountains would move, and the seas would be overturned. Under this sort of disaster, even those with great power would find it difficult to fight against it. No one could predict just how many people would be left in the land of South Morning once the disaster was over. All the forces of power would be thrown into chaos. It did not matter whether it was the berserkers or the shamans. As they crumbled, they would no longer have any order, no sex, no big tribes, and the land would descend into chaos. The beginning of chaos would also be the time after the disaster, and it would be the time for powerful warriors to rise to power. At that moment, at the edge of the sea that surged into the sky in the land of the shamans, there were 8 people charging forward. Among these 8 people, there were 3 women, and the rest were men. The old ones had white hair, and the young ones were only 18 or 19 years old. These 8 people might have come from different tribes, but at that moment, once they gathered together, they were doing the same thing. Run. They were fleeing desperately. There were no experts chasing after them, but at this moment, their expressions were filled with bitterness and fear. Even though there were no experts chasing after him, there were endless roars and huge waves from the endless black Dead Sea. There were also the muffled roars of the endless powerful life forms. 1,000 miles behind them was a mountain. At that moment, that mountain collapsed with a loud bang. The reason for its collapse was because of a huge wave crashing down on it. As it collapsed, the crushed rocks and the mountain itself were submerged by the surging seawater, becoming a part of the boundless sea. In the sky, as the clouds churned and the rain fell, there was a dense flock of birds. These birds came from the Dead Sea. They were born in the Dead Sea and lived out their lives in the sky. When they died, if they had the strength, they would return to the Dead Sea. They formed groups and whistled through the air. Their numbers were endless, and it was impossible to count. It was as if they covered the sky, and wherever they went, there was no rain. These birds were indifferent to the creatures on the ground and in the sea, but they were incredibly aggressive towards all life forms that were not of the same species as them in the sky. Once they ran into them, they would attack in a flock, and they would not stop until they died. However, their numbers seemed endless. Even if a large number of them died, there would still be a large number of new birds rushing out from the seawater. This was just a part of the gigantic sea. At that moment, they were at the edge of the land of the shamans in the land of South Morning, and dangers like this could be found everywhere. We can't fly. We can only walk on the ground. But how are we supposed to cross the Dead Sea behind us? A middle-aged man among the 8 people running on the ground spoke in anguish. Even if we can't travel fast, we have to risk our lives. Only when we reach Eternal Ring Mountain will we have a chance to survive. The one who spoke was a woman among the 8. Her face was pale as she spoke anxiously. Eternal Ring Mountain is the closest rescue spot to us. There's a relocation rune there that's meant for all the shamans. We can only leave through the rune before the seawater drowns it. Only then can we buy enough time to leave the land of the shamans. What's the point of leaving the land of the shamans? My tribe has already fallen apart, and the remaining members of my tribe have already scattered. Even if we go to the land of the berserkers, we might not be able to meet them again. A boy about 18 or 19 years old who had been silent throughout the journey spoke with a bitter smile. As they spoke, a muffled boom came from behind them. The appearance of that sound immediately caused the expressions of the 8 people to change drastically. They no longer spoke, but instead gritted their teeth and increased their speed. At that moment, the sea howled and surged towards them hundreds of leagues behind them. The waves rose high into the air, as if there was a powerful force pushing against them. Wherever they went, everything would be covered by the seawater. A gigantic head popped out from the surface of the sea, and its eyes were staring coldly at the 8 people hundreds of leagues away from them. The mercilessness and aloofness in those eyes caused the 8 people to feel a chill even though they did not turn their heads back. Dead Sea Giant! The hearts of the 8 people who were fleeing trembled. As they charged forward, the seawater behind them closed in on them at an even faster speed. The head on the surface of the sea slowly sank down. It seemed to have disappeared, but soon it popped up from the surface of the sea that was even closer to the 8 people. The seawater spread out and drew closer to the 8 people. From the distance of hundreds of leagues, just now, it was only 100 leagues away from them after a moment. The roars on the surface of the sea and the stench of seawater seemed to be right beside the 8 people. When a huge wave rose up with a howl, it fell down, causing the seawater to spread even faster. The woman who had mentioned Eternal Ring Mountain among the 8 people gritted her teeth and leaped up. She no longer flew at a low altitude, but instead swiftly flew into midair. She coughed out a mouthful of blood, and her body immediately turned into a bloody fog that charged into the distance. The remaining 7 people did the same thing one after another while they hesitated. They turned into 7 long arcs and charged into the sky. There was a towering mountain about hundreds of leagues away from them. That mountain was a mountain range, and it formed a ring. The top of the mountain was not the tip of the mountain, but a platform. It also looked like a ring, and that was the Eternal Ring Mountain they spoke of. The 8 people in the sky no longer cared about each other. With their full speed, they charged towards the mountain, but almost at the instant they flew up, countless birds charged towards them from all directions with loud whistles. The speed of those birds far surpassed theirs. They looked as if they had turned into a gigantic palm that charged towards the 8 people with a sweep. Almost at the instant the bird closed in on them, the 8 people executed their divine abilities. Colorful lights flashed, and as booming sounds echoed in the air, 4 of them rushed out of the bird's encirclement, but the remaining 4 were eternally trapped in the flock of birds. As shrill screams of pain rose into the air, they were torn to shreds, and their broken bodies were left in the stomachs of numerous birds. The 4 people who had used all their abilities to charge out of the birds heard their companions' shrill screams of pain. Their faces turned even paler, and they did not stop in their fear. They charged towards the mountain. They were not far away to begin with, and soon they were less than thousands of feet away from the mountain. At that moment, the seawater beneath them had already spread to less than 10,000 feet from the mountain. At the same time, a large number of flying beasts charged over once again. A moment later, one of the 4 people was surrounded by the flying beasts and was unable to escape. Once he died, the remaining 3 people finally stood on the mountain. There were 2 men and 1 woman. The woman was the one who had mentioned Eternal Ring Mountain. As for the 2 men, one of them was a middle-aged man, and the other an old man. I know how to activate this rune. The 2 of you protect me. The woman immediately took a few quick steps forward and stepped into a rune that was carved on the ground of the mountain. Just as she was fiddling with the rune in an attempt to activate it, the seawater under the mountain closed in. With loud bangs, it crashed into the mountain. In fact, if one stood at the top of the mountain, they could clearly see that the area less than 100-something feet below them had turned into an endless sea. The mountain trembled. Cracks spread out on its surface, as if it could not withstand the impact of the seawater and was about to collapse. At that moment, a gigantic head popped up from the surface of the sea around the mountain. As the seawater howled, a gigantic black hand shot out from the depths of the sea to seize the 3 people on the mountain. From the distance, it looked as if there was a giant in the seawater, and at that moment, it had lifted its hand to destroy everything. Besides the woman, the expressions of the old man and the middle-aged man were filled with shock. Their hearts trembled, and the old man immediately took a step towards the middle-aged man. He lifted his right hand and pushed down violently on his body, intending to push him towards the place where the hand was going to seize him so that he could avoid the disaster. However, almost at the moment he attacked, the middle-aged man instantly moved to the side and lifted his right hand to seize the old man. He had the same intention. At the instant the 2 of them were plotting against each other, a sinister smile appeared on the lips of the woman in the rune. A bright light suddenly erupted from the rune under her, and a pushing force erupted from it, pushing the old man and the middle-aged man off the mountain and into the direction of the gigantic hand that came seize them. *TCH. You. The expressions of the old man and the middle-aged man changed drastically, but before they could say anything, their words turned into pained screams. They were seized by the hand and crushed into pieces of flesh and blood. Once the Dead Sea Giant's hand crushed the old man and the middle-aged man, it continued to clench its fist and charged towards the rune on the mountain with loud booming sounds. "Thank you, both of you." The woman laughed coldly. At that moment, the rune began to circulate, and her figure instantly disappeared. However, at the instant she seemed to have disappeared, she suddenly reappeared. The cold smile on her face turned into shock. She swiftly turned around, and with one glance, she saw that as the rune began to circulate, another figure had appeared beside her. He was dressed in white, had a head full of black hair, a pale face, and a grim expression on his face. He was Su Ming. To be continued. If you like this work, please come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 552. There was a thick aura of death on Su Ming's body at that moment. That aura of death came from the world of Nine, from the time he persevered and watched the entire process of the ancient bronze sword leaving. He saw the world outside the mirror, the round ball in the galaxy, and the countless continents floating in the air. Due to his body not being able to get used to the world outside, he had gradually decayed, and a thick aura of death spread out from within him. Perhaps that aura of death had always existed within his body, but it would only appear in the world outside. At that moment, when Su Ming was just relocated, there were still remnants of that aura of death around him. However, in the woman's eyes, Su Ming, who was currently surrounded by the aura of death, was equivalent to a half-dead person. He did not give off a strong feeling of power, and because of that, resentment appeared in the woman's eyes. According to her plan, she should have already activated the rune and left this place. She should have appeared at a place further away, and as the rune was being activated, this half-dead person had appeared for some unknown reason. This caused the woman to hate Su Ming, and at the same time, hate towards him also rose within her. However, she was a cunning woman. When she looked towards Su Ming, she did not bother about the Dead Sea Giant's fist charging towards her from midair. Fear and a pitiful look appeared on her face, and there was even a pleading look in her eyes. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but her expression did not match. She lifted her hand swiftly and seized Su Ming's arm, who had a dark expression on his face. She yanked his arm, intending to throw him towards the fist and use that chance to activate the rune once again. In her mind, the aura of death spreading out from this body was clearly a half-dead person. With her power as a medial shaman in the later stage, nothing should go wrong. Besides, the disguise on her face should be enough to deceive others. However, what she did not expect was that the moment she grabbed Su Ming's arm and was about to yank him out, she found that she could not budge Su Ming even in the slightest with all her strength. This caused her to be momentarily stunned. At the instant she was stunned, Su Ming lifted his head and did not spare the woman a glance. He took a step forward, and the woman instinctively relaxed her grip on him. She watched as Su Ming walked out of the rune and lifted his head to look at the Dead Sea Giant's fist descending on him as the seawater roared. "Get out of my way!" Su Ming's expression was dark. The scene on the ancient bronze sword had made him incredibly depressed. The things he discovered made it difficult for him to calm down. The moment he returned to the land of South Morning and walked out of the rune, this blind woman and the giant's fist came crashing towards him from the seawater. Almost at the instant Su Ming said those words, the Dead Sea Giant's fist came crashing down. Killing intent shown appeared in Su's eyes. He was in a foul mood. Su Ming lifted of the giant. He lifted of his right and lifted, but he did not. He of the Dead Sea of the rune of the fist came crashing down. This scene made the woman behind Su Ming widen her eyes in disbelief. Her breathing instantly froze, and her mind went blank. The Dead Sea Giant's entire head popped out of the surface of the sea. It was just about to lift its right hand, but with a cold sneer on his lips, Su Ming clenched his right hand and sank it into the giant's fist, causing it to be unable to pull its hand back. At that instant, Su Ming yanked outwards with his right hand. The sea rumbled, and a giant that was about 1,000 feet tall was dragged out of the sea by Su Ming. Once he swung the giant in an arc in midair, Su Ming let go of his right hand, and the giant's body was immediately flung away like a kite with a broken string. However, almost the instant he was flung away, Su Ming took a step forward and rose into the air. In an instant, he caught up to the Dead Sea Giant, and with his right index finger, he tapped the center of the giant's brows. Booming sounds reverberated in the air, and the Dead Sea Giant's head exploded. Its body fell on the surface of the sea in the distance with a bang, and after twitching a few times, it gradually sank to the bottom of the sea. The woman in the mountain's rune was trembling at that moment. When she looked at Su Ming, there was shock and fear in her eyes. She knew that the Dead Sea Giants were incredibly strong. Each of them was equivalent to a ladder shaman, and they had a natural advantage in the sea. If anyone wanted to kill a Dead Sea Giant, they would usually need to possess the power of a ladder shaman in the middle stage. She had also seen the patriarch of the shaman tribe, who was in the middle stage of the shaman tribe attack. He might have killed a Dead Sea Giant, but he had to fight for nearly an hour. Yet now, the young man in white had killed the Dead Sea Giant the moment they met. His actions were as smooth as flowing water, and his movements were clean. He was clearly much stronger than the patriarch of her tribe. "Senior," the woman was just about to speak, but her words died in her throat because she saw Su Ming looking at her coldly from midair. That one look caused a bang to go off in the woman's head, and her consciousness instantly became muddled. When her mind cleared up once again, she could no longer see Su Ming. All she saw was a huge wave that surged into the sky, and it was spreading towards her with a howl. The rune beneath her did not even have time to be activated before her body crumbled under the wave. She, along with the Dead Sea, was swept up and drowned in it. Su Ming walked forward in midair and looked at the seawater beneath him, at the raging waves that surged into the sky, and at the gigantic heads and the countless strange, ferocious beasts that appeared on the surface of the sea. Everything was different from the scene in his memory. The catastrophe of the eastern wastelands was spreading rapidly. It might not have reached its final destination yet, but it was not too far away. Fire ape. Su Ming's eyes widened. He remembered the fire ape, his cave abode, and the medicinal cauldron in it. Whistling sounds came from all around Su Ming as he stood in midair. A large amount of birds closed in on him from all directions. Brutality and bloodlust appeared in their eyes, and they were getting closer and closer to Su Ming. With the catastrophe of the eastern wastelands, even the land of the berserkers will suffer a great disaster. Everyone will be in danger because of this disaster, and it's as if the sky and earth are about to be destroyed. Now is not the time for me to return to the land of the berserkers. I'll have to wait until this disaster is over before I can go back. Besides, I do have a place where I can hide from this disaster. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. At that moment, more birds appeared around him, and they closed in on him in the span of a breath. Yet the instant they closed in, Su Ming waved his arm, and the poisoned corpse instantly manifested before him. Cruelty appeared in the poisoned corpse's eyes. He opened his mouth and coughed out a layer of black and green poisonous fog. That fog spread out in an instant, and the moment it touched the incoming birds, those birds let out piercing screeches and rapidly melted, turning into drops of poison that fell into the sea. Su Ming frowned and looked at his surroundings. The sea was tumbling about, causing him to be unable to determine where he was, which made it difficult for him to locate his cave abode. He did not bother himself with the birds dying around him. Neither did he bother himself with the poison corpse's slaughter. In silence, he spread his divine sense outwards and covered the entire area. However, most of his divine sense was filled with seawater. Su Ming did not even manage to find any obvious mountains in the land behind him that was still being destroyed. Su Ming opened his eyes. As he sank into his thoughts, the image of the mountain where the woman was suddenly appeared in his head. A glint appeared in his eyes, and he patted his storage bag with his right hand. Immediately, a wooden slip appeared in his hand. This was the map of the land of the shamans. Once he focused his attention on it, he found a mountain range that looked like a ring on the map. After a brief analysis, he put away the wooden slip and charged into the distance. The poisoned corpse followed behind him, happily spitting out a mouthful of fog, causing the long arc that was Su Ming to look like he was enveloped by a layer of black and green fog from a distance. Wherever he went, the numerous birds in the sky would immediately turn into poison the moment they touched him. After flying for about the time it takes for an incense stick to burn in the sky above the endless sea, Su Ming spread his divine sense outwards. The entire area of several thousands of lis was filled with water. There were also a large number of ferocious beasts in the sea that seemed to have noticed Su Ming's divine sense and looked towards his direction. The giants in the sea were even letting out faint roars. In fact, while he was in midair, Su Ming gradually noticed that some of the birds that were flying towards him did not immediately melt once they came into contact with the poison. Instead, they persevered and charged forward for some distance before they gradually started melting. This discovery made a glint appear in Su Ming's eyes. As he observed, he could gradually tell that there was no end to the flock of birds. No matter how many of them died, there were still some that continued flying out of the seawater. It was clear that the birds that flew out were resisting the poisonous fog. If this went on, it wouldn't be long before the poison corpse's fog would be weakened to the limit. No wonder. Su Ming waved his arm and put away the poison corpse. He lifted his right hand and swung it. Immediately, green light shone, and the small virescent sword immediately grew in size to circle around Su Ming. With the small sword around, when a large number of birds closed in on Su Ming as he moved forward, the green light would flash and circle around him. However, there were simply too many birds, and Su Ming would not be able to kill them all. He could only warp, and once he attracted a large number of birds, he would leave in an instant. After about several hours, Su Ming came to an abrupt halt in midair, and a grave look appeared on his face. With his divine sense, he saw a vortex on the surface of the sea several thousands of lis away from him. A presence that made Su Ming feel danger was spreading out from within that vortex. To Su Ming, that presence had already surpassed that of an end shaman. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he disappeared in an instant, avoiding the vortex that was spinning in the distance. He rushed towards his cave abode on the surface of the sea. Several days later, a long arc charged through the sea that was originally the land of the shamans, but had now turned into an ocean. Behind that long arc was a large flock of birds chasing after it, and at the head of that flock was a bird that looked like a peacock with its entire body shining with a five-colored light. That creature's eyes were aloof, and its body was several thousands of feet big. It was chasing after Su Ming. Several days later, roars reverberated in the air on the surface of the sea, and gigantic tentacles shot out from the bottom of the sea. Wherever they went, cracks would appear in the air, and those tentacles charged towards Su Ming in the sky. The eastern wastelands haven't crashed into each other yet, and just the powerful existences in the Dead Sea are already so difficult to deal with. With a flash, Su Ming disappeared in midair. There's still one last chapter left. I won't use it as an explosive release. The last chapter will be released at midnight, and then I'll explode with the double amount of monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 553. At that moment, there was a large flock of birds circling in midair about 1,000 lis away from where Su Ming was charging towards them. These birds were slightly different from the ones Su Ming had run into before. They had 3 claws, and their heads were slightly bigger. Each of them was about 5 feet tall. Wah, wah, wah. Screeches that sounded like babies crying reverberated in the air. This was a sound unique to these birds. There were 6 shamans surrounded by these birds, and their faces were stark pale as they fought back madly. However, the highest level of cultivation among these 6 was only at the peak of medial shaman stage. It was difficult for them to last for long under the encirclement of these birds. As they cried out to fight back, the 6 gradually became 5, and after a moment there were only 2 people left. One of them was a boy with a pale face and a terrified look on his face. He looked to be about 15 or 16 years old and was incredibly handsome. The other was a middle-aged woman. She had average looks, but when she attacked, she would protect the boy. They looked like mother and son, but there was no resemblance between their faces. However, She did not last for long before one of the birds seized the woman's head and dragged her into the flock. As she let out shrill screams of pain, she was reduced to pieces of flesh and blood. "My beloved concubine!" The boy let out a sorrowful cry. Tears welled up in his eyes, and his face was filled with grief. "You're my 39th beloved concubine, and you've left me as well? How am I supposed to continue living like this?" The boy looked as if his grief had reached its peak. With bloodshot eyes, he roared at the ferocious birds that were pouncing on him. "Damn you, we're the same kind. How could you not show me any respect? I'm angry." When the boy saw the birds closing in on him, he gritted his teeth, and with a bang, his body turned into a layer of black fog. This sudden change caused the birds around him to freeze for a moment, and the instant they froze, the black fog immediately gathered together and turned into a black crane. That crane roared and flapped its wings to fly a few circles before the birds, as if it was telling them that it also had wings. "Did you see that? Did you see that? I'm also a bird, we're family." The ferocious birds around him froze for a moment due to the boy's sudden change, then continued charging towards him without any hesitation. This made the black crane immediately widen its eyes, and deep grief appeared within them. "You've gone too far." With another bang, the black crane turned into mist once again. However, the mist quickly gathered together, and this time, what appeared before the birds was another crane that looked exactly like them, with 3 claws. This change stunned the birds. With their low intelligence, they could not tell what was happening before their eyes. However, the hesitation flashing in their savage eyes made the black crane, who had turned into one of them, extremely nervous. "Wah, wah, 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 wah." In its nervousness, the black crane hurriedly opened its mouth and imitated the cries of this flock of birds as it quickly shouted a few words. Perhaps it was the effect of those few unique cries, or perhaps it was the sudden appearance of a long arc in the distance that had caught the attention of the birds in the area. But once the black crane let out its cries, the birds in the area immediately turned their heads around and looked at the long arc that was coming from the distance. As they charged forward, piercing cries of babies rose in the air, and the flock of birds charged towards the long arc. The black crane that had turned into one of them originally wanted to leave, but it was surrounded by the birds and did not dare to leave alone to attract attention. Hence, with gritted teeth, it followed the flock of birds and rushed towards the long arc. As it flew, it saw that its own kind were letting out piercing cries, and without any hesitation, it started shouting with all its might. "Wah, wah, wah. Wah, 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 wah." As the black crane shouted, it felt that it was rather smooth. It remembered that it had managed to survive because of the same shout, so it became even more pleased with itself. Vaguely, its voice was extremely loud and clear among the many birds' cries. Su Ming turned into a long arc in midair and moved swiftly. Occasionally, he would warp to avoid the dangers in the area and the pursuers that he could not shake off. Su Ming had a deep impression of the powerful existences in the Dead Sea and in midair. It had only been a few days, and he had already run into several of them. If it was not because his divine sense was powerful and he could warp, it would have been difficult for him to avoid them. Before long, as he continued charging forward, a sharp glint appeared in his eyes. He saw a flock of birds he had never seen before, and they were charging towards him while roaring. These birds were clearly larger than the ones Su Ming had seen before, and they were also much faster. They had also spread out and blocked Su Ming's path. In an instant, they filled the air and closed in on him. Su Ming's expression was aloof. He did not stop for even a single moment as he moved forward and charged towards a flock of birds. Right when the two of them closed in on each other, green light immediately shone beside Su Ming. Wherever it went, the birds that were blocking his way would be pierced through as they let out shrill screams. Su Ming attacked resolutely and did not stop. By the looks of it, he wanted to charge through this place and kill his way out of the flock of birds. Su Ming had done this more than once during the past few days. He did not need to kill all of them. As long as he opened up a gap and moved through, he would be able to shake off these birds. Unless he ran in the five-colored peacock from 3 days ago, then he would be fine. When he thought of that peacock, fear still lingered in Su Ming's heart. The peacock's strength lay in its five-colored light, and it possessed the power to confuse a person's mind. As he moved forward, Su Ming lifted his right index finger. Every single time his finger fell, a bird's body would shatter and die. In the span of about 10 breaths, Su Ming had already charged into the depths of the flock of non-flying birds. Before long, he would be able to shoot through the flock of birds like an arrow. At that moment, he saw a three-clawed bird crying out as if it wanted to retreat, but it was blocked by its own kind rushing towards Su Ming, and it was forced to be pushed towards him. As Su Ming took a step forward, he lifted his right hand and pointed at the terrified and incessantly screeching bird. Yet the instant his finger landed, the bird no longer screeched. Instead, it widened its eyes and let out a piercing screech. It's me. I'm not the same kind as them. I'm that crane." The bird that was the black crane immediately started shouting in fear, as if it was afraid that Su Ming would not believe it. Black fog immediately manifested on its face, and a crane's head was revealed. Su Ming was momentarily stunned. His right hand immediately froze in midair, but he did not have time to think. Immediately, a five-colored light shone from the direction he was coming from, and the bird that looked like the five-colored peacock that had been chasing after him a few days ago was charging towards him at an incredible speed. Su Ming's expression changed. He no longer bothered himself with the black crane and turned around to take a step forward, charging straight towards the birds before him. As booming sounds reverberated in the air, Su Ming broke out of the flock's encirclement and charged into the distance at full speed. As the flock of birds screeched, they chased after him. The five-colored peacock also charged past the flock of birds in a flash and chased after Su Ming. Hatred appeared in its eyes, as if it would not give up until it caught up to Su Ming. Su Ming was in front, the five-colored peacock was right behind him, and the large flock of birds was right at the back. In the span of a breath, they left into the distance, leaving behind only the black crane that had revealed its head in midair. It blinked, then suddenly started laughing smugly, and excitement appeared on its face. "Darn it all, if I'm going to change, then I'll turn into that five-colored bird. That's more fitting of my status. I'd like to see just who would dare bully me after I turn into that bird. If anyone dares to bully me, then I'll scare them to death." In the midst of the black crane's smugness, its body turned into black fog with a bang. Once it gradually gathered together, it immediately turned into a five-colored peacock in midair. It looked at its current appearance with excitement, then lifted its head elegantly and flew slowly into the distance. If the five-colored peacock is already so powerful, then wouldn't I be even more intimidating if I turned into the seven-colored peacock? Before long, the five-colored peacock, which was the black crane, turned its eyes and turned into black fog once again. After a moment, a beautiful seven-colored peacock appeared in the world, and with pride and smugness, it left into the distance. As for Su Ming, after a few warps, he finally managed to temporarily shake off the five-colored peacock's pursuit. A few days ago, when he first met the peacock, he had fought against it. But not only could the peacock's five-colored light confuse his mind, it also contained a strange power that suppressed Su Ming's power to the point that he could not bring out his full power. Once the peacock appeared, a large amount of birds would quickly gather around it. Because of that, the battle became even more difficult. Once he was surrounded by hundreds of thousands, even millions or even more birds, Su Ming could not help but feel his skin crawl. Once he shook off the peacock, Su Ming brought out the wooden slip. Once he checked his location once again, he sucked in a deep breath and charged forward. Several days later, after taking a few huge detours and avoiding some of the regions that made him feel threatened, he finally arrived at a tumbling sea. As he stood in midair, Su Ming lowered his head and looked at the surface of the sea with a slightly sentimental look on his face. Based on his deductions on the map, this was where his cave abode was located. However, he was now in the depths of the sea. Su Ming could clearly feel the world changing around him at that moment. He remained silent for a moment before he charged towards the surface of the sea. His body disappeared into the seawater as he charged towards the bottom of the sea. The moment he dived into the sea, Su Ming immediately felt a powerful force pushing him forward from the seawater. It swept up his body and pushed him into the distance. And it was this force pushing him forward that caused the seawater to continue spreading outwards. Golden light shone on Su Ming's body, and he forcefully resisted the force pushing him forward. He spread his divine sense outwards and charged swiftly towards the bottom of the sea. Everything around him was dark. Fortunately, even though he could not spread his divine sense too far, he could still see his surroundings clearly. The seawater was not too deep either. After a moment, Su Ming avoided some of the ferocious beasts in the sea and gradually saw a mountain range that looked like a dragon's mouth in the depths of the sea. There was also a gigantic crack beyond the mountain range, along with a dull screen of light. This screen of light was set up by Hong Luo in the past. 15 years had passed since then, but it was still around. However, it was clear that it had become incredibly weak, which was why it could no longer hide the mountain. However, it could still be used as a form of defense. Su Ming charged towards the screen of light, and in the blink of an eye, he closed in on it. Once he lifted his right hand and pressed it, his body fused into the screen of light. Finally, I'm done. I don't know anything anymore. The chapters that appeared from the 28th onward can be said to have exploded. The double monthly votes are about to start. After 12 a.m., when the double votes start, everyone, can you please give me a surprise? Tomorrow will be the 4th chapter, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 554. I've just released the 66 compensation, and I've cleared all my debts. I'm excited, happy, and relaxed. I finally don't have to owe anything anymore. I could drink some alcohol to celebrate. But when I look up, damn it, why is it the 28th? Double the monthly votes, double. This time, the double came too fast, and I can't bear it. I can only put down the alcohol and go to bed for tomorrow's breakout. I need to wake up early, or I'll write very slowly. I need to sleep early, or I won't be able to wake up. I can't drink, and I can't read novels. The miserable 3 days, or 10 days, are about to start. I'm begging for excitement, surprise, monthly votes, recommendations, clicks, this and that. I'm begging for nothing more than to rise. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 555. There was no seawater. When Su Ming disappeared beyond the screen of light in the depths of the sea and stepped into the mountain range that he had not seen for 15 years, but felt to be an endless amount of time to him, he looked at the vague familiarity in his memories and looked at everything around him, and a slightly sentimental expression appeared on his face. Due to the screen of light, the seawater from the world outside had yet to pour in. However, by the looks of it, it would not be able to last for long before it shattered, turning this place into a true abyss at the bottom of the sea. The frozen gate was still there under the mountain range, and waves of freezing air were spreading out from it. Su Ming's gaze fell on it, and a glint appeared in his eyes. The place he had thought of to avoid the catastrophe of the eastern wastelands was the frozen world that the frozen gate led to. Based on Su Ming's guesses, the terrifying turtle should not still be waiting there. That was why the frozen world was the best place to hide. When the catastrophe of the eastern wastelands arrives, it doesn't matter whether it's the shamans or the berserkers, they will definitely use all their methods to search for a place to hide. I wonder how Master is now. Su Ming fell silent. He did not want to think about his master, his eldest senior brother, second senior brother, Zi Che, and the 9th summit that was like his home. Because every single time he thought about it, complicated feelings would rise in his heart. He had left the 9th summit in the past to join the great war between the shamans and berserkers, but he had not expected that they would be separated for nearly 20 years. With Master's level of cultivation, even if it's the catastrophe of the eastern wastelands, it shouldn't be a problem. Eldest senior brother might have already come out of isolation. Second senior brother, is he still in the ninth summit? There's also Huzi. Su-ming closed his eyes. Ever since he returned from the world of Nine, he had learned many things that shocked him. Once he saw the immortals' world outside, he suddenly missed the ninth summit. He missed it so much, memories of the past slowly surfaced in his head. The plants and trees in the ninth summit, his eldest senior brother's silent care, and his second senior brother lifting his head so that his side profile was illuminated by the sun. With a smile on his face, he said, "This isn't good." Those words echoed in Su-ming's ears softly. Huzi's snores, his bad habit of peeping at others, and his master who wore all sorts of clothes. All of these things in the past had now turned into memories. I'll hide from the catastrophe of the eastern wastelands here. Once it's over, I'll return to the ninth summit, Su-ming mumbled. Su-ming mumbled and opened his eyes. The fire ape did not come to this place. This was something he had noticed when he stepped into the screen of light and spread his divine sense outwards. The fire ape was not here. Perhaps the fire ape had gone out before the seawater covered it. When it wanted to return, the seawater had covered everything. Su-ming sighed and charged towards the cave abode in the mountain range. Once he stepped into the stone chamber with the medicinal cauldron, his footsteps came to a halt. He smelled a faint medicinal fragrance, and a glint appeared in his eyes. His gaze immediately landed on the medicinal cauldron. Once he scrutinized it, he fell into a moment of pensive silence before he waved his arm and put away the medicinal cauldron. He then went around the cave abode once and took away all the items he had left behind in the past. Once he did so, he stood beside the stone wall in the depths of the cave abode and fell into deep thought. This rock wall was connected to the mountain range. Once it was opened, the power of the severing three banes would explode out like a dragon's head awakening. Once Su-ming completed the structure of this place, he had never opened it completely. He was worried that once he did so, the power of the world would be so dense that it would attract the attention of the world outside. However, if he left just like that and allowed this place to be destroyed, once it was submerged by the seawater, Su-ming would be slightly unwilling to do so. He did not want to waste the structure he had built in the past. Once I open this place, the vast amount of power of the world that will gather here will not only be beneficial to my level of cultivation and allow my berserker bones to become stronger, it will also allow the medicinal cores in the medicinal cauldron to be activated to their greatest extent. Su-ming fell into deep thought. When he put away the medicinal cauldron just now, he had smelled a faint medicinal fragrance spreading outwards, and he had also observed the medicinal cauldron for a moment. The medicinal pill in the medicinal cauldron was already at the final stage of its activation. A freezing glare shone in Su-ming's eyes. He lifted his right hand and swung it in the air. Immediately, the medicinal cauldron that he had put away manifested once again. This time, Su-ming placed it before the stone wall. This place would be the center of the power of the world in the area once the stone wall was opened. It was also the place where the power of the world was the thickest. It would allow the medicinal cauldron to be activated to its greatest extent. Once he put down the medicinal cauldron, Su-ming's body instantly became indistinct and he disappeared without a trace. When he reappeared, he was already in midair outside his cave abode. He looked at the dull screen of light, and after a moment of pensive silence, he spread his divine sense outwards. At the same time, his nascent divinity also manifested behind him. That nascent divinity spread outwards and gradually fused with the dull screen of light. This screen of light was left behind by Hong Luo in the past. Once Hong Luo died, he lost his connection to the screen of light, which was why it was slowly weakening. Even if Su-ming had the power of an immortal at the soul formation stage, it was still difficult for him to use any other method to strengthen the rune. The only thing he could do was to fuse his nascent divinity with the rune. With this method, he could delay the rune's collapse and also strengthen it slightly. Once he finished doing all this, Su-ming sucked in a deep breath and turned around swiftly to look at the mountain range that looked like a dragon's head. He lifted his right hand and pushed at the air above the mountain. With it, The mountain range instantly rumbled, and the cover Su Ming had left behind for the execution of the three evils in the past was completely removed at that moment. As the rumbling sounds reverberated in the air, Su Ming appeared beside the medicinal cauldron in his cave abode. Without a hint of hesitation, he touched the wall with his right hand, and cracking sounds immediately reverberated in the air. Fine cracks instantly appeared on the wall. More and more cracks appeared, and in just a moment, they covered the entire mountain wall. A muffled bang reverberated in the air and spread out. The mountain wall shattered to pieces before Su Ming and completely crumbled. As it crumbled, it was as if a gap had been opened up in the depths of Su Ming's cave abode, as if the intersecting mountain ranges had turned into a sliver of sky. Almost at the instant the mountain wall crumbled, a roar that sounded like a dragon's roar reverberated in the mountain range. Soon after, the mountain range started trembling viciously. Wisps of the power of the world were sucked in from all directions, causing the place to turn into a gigantic vortex. In the depths of the vortex was the medicinal cauldron. Su Ming sat cross-legged on the medicinal cauldron and closed his eyes to meditate. As the power of the world surged into him and was continuously absorbed by the medicinal cauldron beneath him, the vortex grew larger. After a moment, it covered the entire cave abode. Time trickled by, and in the blink of an eye, 3 days went by. During those 3 days, the vortex in the cave abode did not just cover the cave abode, but also the entire mountain. That vortex looked like a dragon's head that was madly devouring everything. As the vortex grew larger, the power of the world surged into the depths of the Dead Sea with loud booming sounds. Gradually, it swept up the Dead Sea, and a strange change appeared. This change caught the attention of a large number of living beings in the Dead Sea. However, there was a screen of light from the rune in this place. Once Su Ming's nascent divinity fused with it, the rune covered up the mountain range and the cave abode, causing the area to look empty from the outside. Besides, the Dead Sea was spreading outwards, and it was a unique period of time for Eastern Wastelands. As the pushing force from the Dead Sea grew stronger, even if a large amount of the power of the world was gathering together, most of the living beings in the Dead Sea did not pay any attention to it once they noticed it. However, there were still some who came following the traces left behind. Time passed by once again, and soon, 7 days went by. During these 7 days, Su Ming's nascent divinity, who had fused with the screen of light, could clearly sense that the pushing force from the Dead Sea had become much stronger compared to a few days ago. In fact, the rune was also flashing violently under that pushing force. At the same time, Su Ming's nascent divinity saw 8 gigantic Dead Sea giants outside the rune. There was even an aquatic dragon that was several thousands of feet long. It was also moving about nearby, and there were quite a number of other living beings in the Dead Sea. All of them had been lured over by the thick power of the world gathering together in this place. But the strength of Hong Luo's rune made it impossible for them to see through it within a short period of time, and they could only linger around the area. However, as the pushing force from the Dead Sea grew stronger, the living beings in the area gradually found it difficult to stay in one place for a long period of time, and a large number of them left. However, as the pushing force from the Dead Sea grew stronger, the rune that had fused Su Ming's nascent divinity into was also affected. As it flashed violently, it gradually became unable to hide itself. Eventually, another 3 days passed, and the rune slowly revealed itself from the air. At the instant it shone, it was immediately locked down by several powerful presences around it. Roars reverberated in the Dead Sea, and the 3 Dead Sea giants who remained in the Dead Sea strode towards it. The other living beings from the Dead Sea also charged forward and closed in on the rune that had appeared in the Dead Sea. At that moment, Su Ming still had the medicinal cauldron. It had yet to completely absorb the power of the world. Su Ming's situation was slightly better, but the medicinal cauldron was at a critical moment. It was only halfway through the process of activating the rune. When Su Ming saw the living beings from the Dead Sea continuously closing in on him, he opened his eyes as he sat on the medicinal cauldron. Killing intent shone in his eyes, and with a single move, he charged out from the gigantic vortex around him. When he reappeared, he was already in the Dead Sea beyond the screen of light from the rune. At the instant he appeared, a Dead Sea giant swiftly closed in on him. It lifted its gigantic fist and was just about to ram it against the screen of light, as if it wanted to tear apart the rune. Su Ming smiled coldly and lifted his right hand swiftly before pointing at the incoming Dead Sea giant. Immediately, a layer of lightning sparks rose with a loud rumble and instantly enveloped the Dead Sea giant. Soon after, a freezing glare shone in Su Ming's eyes as he stood in the Dead Sea. He clenched his right hand into a fist, intending to hurl it against the incoming Dead Sea giant. But before his fist could land, the pushing force in the Dead Sea suddenly increased at an indescribable speed. As booming sounds reverberated in the air, it even looked as if it wanted to tear apart the sea. Under that pushing force, all the Dead Sea giants in the area were swept away by that pushing force. In fact, the ground started trembling violently at that instant. Cracks appeared on the ground with cracking sounds, and some parts of the ground even exploded. Su Ming was also unable to control himself. That huge force was not something a human could fight against. His expression changed drastically, and a shocking thought rose in his head. It crashed. The first update is here. The double is very intense. Moreover, it's the end of the month. These monthly tickets are like fragrant rice, like aged wine. Everyone is fighting over them. My ears are very hungry. Let's share some with everyone, to be continued. If you like this work, please come Achidian. Come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 556. Right when this thought appeared in his head, Su Ming was swept 10,000 feet away by the astonishing pushing force from the Dead Sea. When he saw that he was about to be swept even further away, golden light shone brilliantly on Su Ming's body, and he came to an abrupt halt. Cracking sounds came from his body, and he forced himself to stop for an instant as the pushing force pushed him forward. At the instant his body stopped moving, his nascent divinity manifested behind him and warped with Su Ming, disappearing from the violent and violent flow of the Dead Sea. When he reappeared, Su Ming was already in the rune. At that moment, the rune was flashing furiously, and fine lines had also appeared on its surface. It looked like it would not be able to last for long. The catastrophe of the Eastern Wastelands has begun. As Su Ming used his nascent divinity to strengthen the rune, he stood in the rune and looked at the powerful force sweeping against him as he mumbled under his breath. He could still hear muffled booms coming from outside. The ground at the bottom of the sea was shattering viciously. The water in the sea tumbled about, and an innumerable amount of living creatures in the sea were swept away. Su Ming's face was slightly pale. The powerful force just now had given him a feeling that he could not fight against it. After all, his level of cultivation was extraordinary, and the strength of his physical body was unimaginable. Even in the entire land of the shamans and berserkers, he could still be considered as a powerful berserker. However, even with his current strength, he could still sense the terror of the force pushing against him from the sea. In silence, Su Ming lifted his right hand and pressed it against the screen of light that had fused his nascent divinity into. His divine sense swiftly spread out from the screen of light. This was Su Ming spreading out his divine sense at full power. Before long, his divine sense rushed out of the sea, and he saw the world outside. Clouds tumbled about in the sky. Thunder rumbled, and as bolts of lightning sliced through the sky, some of them even crashed into the sea. The storm raged madly, and there was also a high wind howling in the air. The strength of that wind stirred up waves that surged into the sky and clouds. Su Ming's divine sense started showing signs of becoming unstable in that violent gust of wind. In a place that Su Ming could not detect with his divine sense was the edge of the land of the shamans in the land of South Morning. At that moment, he could no longer see the ground. He could only see an endless amount of seawater tumbling about, as well as the gigantic eastern wastelands on the surface of the sea. The first thing that touched the land of South Morning was the edge of eastern wastelands. It only lasted for an instant, but already brought about a tremor that turned the sky and earth upside down in the land of South Morning, including the shock Su Ming felt just now. As the land of South Morning trembled, countless mountains collapsed. Sky Mist City's walls also trembled viciously. Seawater was already roaring in the direction of the shamans under the city walls, and it continued crashing against Sky Mist City, as if it wanted to break it down and rush into the land of the berserkers. As eastern wastelands crashed into each other, a muffled boom that shook the sky and earth and reverberated through the entire land of South Morning rose into the air. At the instant that sound reverberated in the air, eastern wastelands and the land of South Morning crashed into each other violently once again. This time, the border of eastern wastelands crashed into the land of South Morning. As the deafening boom reverberated in the air, the land of South Morning trembled even more violently. If anyone looked down on the land of South Morning from the highest point in the sky, then they would be able to see a gigantic crack spreading from the spot where eastern wastelands crashed into each other. With an extreme speed, cracking sounds and rumbling sounds, the crack spread to the depths of the land of South Morning. In the blink of an eye, it was nearly 1 million lis long. There was not just one crack, but many of them. It was as if the entire land of South Morning was about to be torn apart. One of the cracks closed in on Sky Mist City. The instant it touched Sky Mist Mountain Range, booming sounds reverberated in the air, and a gap appeared on Sky Mist Mountain Range. The crack continued spreading through the land of the berserkers through that gap. It shot through Sky Mist Mountain Range and became the first crack that penetrated deep into the land of the berserkers. As the gap appeared, a large amount of seawater surged madly into the land of the berserkers through it. Under the violent impact and the endless high wind in the sky, Sky Mist Barrier was torn to pieces. The barrier that had protected the land of the berserkers for many years was destroyed at that moment. The booming sounds in the land of South Morning continued, shaking the sky, and did not show any signs of stopping. It was especially so at the edge where eastern wastelands crashed into the land of the berserkers. A large amount of the land crumbled and shattered. It might have seemed slow, but in truth, it was shattering at an incredibly fast speed. As the cracks spread out, quite a number of places in the land of South Morning were torn off as the cracks intersected with each other. As it trembled and the Dead Sea crashed into it, those places turned into dust that was submerged. All of this was just the beginning. The crashing continued. Compared to the damage suffered by the land of South Morning, Eastern Wastelands, which was several times bigger than the land of South Morning, was in a much better state. However, there were still shattering and cracks appearing on the land of the berserkers. Seawater roared and submerged the land of the berserkers. This was a disaster to the people in Eastern Wastelands, but to the people of South Morning, this was a disaster. The powerful collision between the two continents stirred up the changes in the world and stirred up an endless amount of power. It was not something that a person could fight against, unless their level of cultivation had reached an incredibly high level. However, it was clear that the berserkers and the shamans did not possess this sort of power. Because of that, they could only struggle bitterly under this disaster. The sea roared, the ground was torn apart, and countless tribes were submerged. An innumerable amount of people lost their lives in the midst of their shrill fear. That included the berserkers. At the moment Sky Mist Barrier collapsed, their fates were sealed, and the mark of death was branded on them. As the violent gust of wind howled in the sky above the land of the shamans, the flying beasts of the shaman tribe were either torn apart by the wind as they fled madly, or they were swarmed by the birds in the wind. When they left, not a single piece of flesh or blood was left behind. There was a gigantic beast in the sky near the land of the berserkers. It looked like a mackerel pike. It should have been swimming gracefully in the sky, but at that moment, it was charging forward madly. However, there were countless birds surrounding its body, and there was also a violent gust of wind continuously tearing at its body. Eventually, once it reached the land of the berserkers, the mackerel pike let out the final cry of its life. Its body was torn to shreds by the violent gust of wind in midair with a bang, turning into an endless amount of flesh and blood that scattered everywhere. However, before these pieces of flesh and blood could fall into the sea, they were devoured by the endless number of birds charging towards them. Han Mountain City was the first city Su Ming came to in the land of South Morning. At that moment, there were very few people in the city, but there were still some old people sitting on the mountains of their respective tribes, watching the change in the world in silence. They did not want to leave. They were already old and no longer had the courage to leave their homes. What they had was the determination to die with their tribes, their mountains, and their homes. What awaited them was a vast ocean of seawater and the mountains that started collapsing as the ground trembled. After a moment, the entire Han Mountain City turned into ruins and was submerged in the roaring Dead Sea, becoming a thing of the past. The ground trembled, and the entire land of South Morning started being pushed to the west. The ground trembled, and the mountains either collapsed or were submerged. The sky was either filled with violent gusts of wind or rainstorm. Lightning covered everything, causing the land of South Morning to turn into a forbidden zone for all life. However, there were still some people who struggled, fought back, and went mad with an unwillingness to admit defeat. Yet in the end, besides death, besides giving up, they had no other choice. As the number of cracks increased, the borders of the land of South Morning, the land belonging to the shamans, had completely collapsed. Numerous small pieces of land scattered in the seawater. The cracks that spread through the entire land of South Morning went as deep as the entire continent. Usually, once they intersected with each other and connected with each other, they would be separated. This was a disaster. No one knew how long it would last. No one knew how much this change would develop. But it was clear that all of this was just the start of the disaster. Su Ming could not see the changes on the entire continent. He could only see the things happening in a circular area of thousands of leagues around him. He saw the ground shattering, the mountains collapsing, the land being separated, and he also saw a gigantic crack charging towards his cave abode from thousands of leagues away. Su Ming's heart trembled. He instantly retrieved his divine sense. Most of it had already dissipated due to the violent gust of wind. Once he retrieved it, Su Ming's face turned pale, and he retreated swiftly. In the blink of an eye, he appeared at the medicinal cauldron in his cave abode. At that moment, the medicinal cauldron had still not been completely activated. It was just a little bit away. It was also at that moment that the screen of light that had fused with his nascent divinity could no longer withstand the tremors and the push. It shattered with a bang, and as it crumbled and Su Ming's nascent divinity tumbled backwards, a large amount of seawater surged madly into it, and the powerful push came charging towards him. Almost in an instant, the entire cave abode and the entire mountain range were covered by the Dead Sea. At the instant it did so, golden light shone around Su Ming's body and enveloped the medicinal cauldron. With his body, he fought against the power of the Dead Sea, allowing the medicinal cauldron to last for a few breaths. Then, a medicinal fragrance spread out in a large area, and the activation within the cauldron came to an end. Su Ming's face was pale, and blood trickled down the corners of his mouth. Without a hint of hesitation, he immediately put away the medicinal cauldron. He did not even have time to look at the medicinal cores within. With one move, he warped towards the world outside, and when he reappeared, he was already right beside the frozen door that had been submerged. Almost the instant he closed in, booming sounds reverberated in the air 1,000 feet away, and a crack that was several thousands of feet wide spread out rapidly. It shot through Su Ming's feet, causing his feet to be in the air, and the frozen gate fell into the depths of the crack. It was dark underneath. That was the deepest part of the land of South Morning. Perhaps it was also the true deepest part of the Dead Sea. Without any hesitation, Su Ming warped a few times, and once he coughed out a mouthful of blood, he caught up to the sinking frozen door. He pressed his palm against it, and the instant the ice shattered, he rushed into the door. A dark light shone in the darkness, and Su Ming disappeared. The frozen door continued sinking until it disappeared into the darkness. No one knew where it had sunk to. The catastrophe of the eastern wastelands was still raging fiercely. Lives were struggling and fighting back continuously. At the bottom of the Dead Sea, countless tribes were submerged. There were quite a number of broken houses within those tribes, and there were people who did not manage to leave in time or who did not want to leave. Their eyes were wide open as they turned into corpses that would last for eternity in the depths of the Dead Sea. I'm sending the second chapter, asking for monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 557. It was a quiet world, a frozen land that existed in the darkness. There was no forceful wind pushing them forward. Neither was there any tremors that would make people feel uneasy. This place was filled with dead silence. The ice sculptures and ice mountains turned into an eternal and unchanging scene in this frozen land, except for a gigantic turtle that had its eyes wide open and was glaring at an ice mountain. It was breathing harshly, and its gaze was filled with hate. If its gaze could kill, then Su Ming, who was in the ice mountain, would have definitely died several times over. Su Ming smiled wryly. Besides that, he simply could not express the gloom in his heart. He did not expect that the turtle would still hold a grudge against him after 15 years. It had actually laid there and stared at the ice mountain for 15 years, until 2 hours ago, the turtle saw Su Ming. The moment he appeared in this place, Su Ming saw the turtle and froze. The turtle's eyes shone with a powerful light as it stared at him. The man and turtle stared at each other with the ice mountain between them. Su Ming had a deep impression of this turtle in the past. Its strength was still fresh in his mind. His current level of cultivation might be different from before, but he could tell just how strong this turtle was even more clearly. This was a strength that surpassed that of an end shaman. Based on Su Ming's analysis, it might be equivalent to life cultivation. Su Ming fell into pensive silence for a moment before he lifted his right hand slowly. At the instant he did so, the turtle lifted its head and let out a roar at him. Its roar seeped through the ice, causing Su Ming's ears to buzz and a sharp pain to shoot through him. A glint appeared in his eyes, but he did not stop moving his right hand. Instead, he continued lifting his right hand and pushed it forward. Immediately, the layer of ice before him let out cracking sounds, and cracks appeared. When the turtle saw that its roar did not have any effect in intimidating Su Ming, it lifted its tail with a low growl and whipped it towards the ice mountain. With a whoosh, just as its tail was about to touch the ice mountain, it swiftly pulled it back and continued roaring in frustration. Su Ming let out a sigh of relief in his heart. He remembered that this beast had been unwilling to destroy the ice mountain in the past. Now that he tested it, it was indeed still the same. If worst comes to worst, I'll just not go out. Su Ming gritted his teeth and no longer bothered himself with the turtle glaring at him from beyond the ice mountain. Instead, he lifted his hand and parted the layer of ice around him, opening up a spot where he could sit down and meditate. It was also a spot that could accommodate some of his items. I wonder where the door leading to the land of South Morning has sunk. I won't be able to go back within a short period of time. By the looks of it, this catastrophe of the eastern wastelands won't end without a few years. Oh well, since the turtle is outside, I won't be able to go out either. I might as well isolate myself here for a few years. Besides, I still have some items that I need to refine and activate. In the midst of his silence, Su Ming looked at his surroundings. The ice mountain was not big, and it was not convenient for him to make the ice mountain too thin. Because of that, it was incredibly inconvenient. Su Ming lowered his head and fell into deep thought. After a moment, a glint appeared in his eyes, and he looked at the surface of the ice beneath him. If I can't go out, then I can dig a tunnel and open up a cave abode that belongs to me under this ice. A brilliant glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He lifted his head and cast a glance at the turtle staring at him, then lifted his right hand and hurled a punch at the ground beneath his feet. With his power in the past, he could not open up the ice that was too deep, but the current Su Ming was no longer the past. The instant his fist landed, cracks immediately appeared on the layer of ice. The turtle outside was clearly momentarily stunned. Then its roars became even louder. It swung its tail back and forth, as if Su Ming's actions had ignited an even greater rage within it. Su Ming did not bother himself with the turtle outside. After throwing a dozen-something punches, the layer of ice under his feet shattered, and his body immediately sank down. As booming sounds continued echoing in the air, a simple cave abode sealed in ice under the ice mountain and right under the turtle was opened up by Su Ming. The cave abode was still very crude and could only be considered to be a big cave. Su Ming stood in the cave and looked at the turtle roaring at him with its head lowered through the ice. He smiled faintly and started busying himself around the area. Before long, the cave abode became slightly bigger. Once it turned into an empty space, Su Ming sat down cross-legged and closed his eyes, immersing himself in meditation. He spread his divine sense outwards, seeming as if he was not paying attention to the turtle. But if the turtle showed any signs of breaking through the layer of ice, Su Ming would immediately notice it. Time trickled by. A month later, Su Ming opened his eyes and lifted his head to look at the turtle. During this month, he had been getting along very well with the turtle. Besides glaring at him, the turtle did not do anything else. Su Ming averted his gaze. At that moment, his injuries had recovered. It did not matter whether it was the power of his berserker bones or his other attributes. They had all reached their peak. In silence, he lifted his right hand and flipped it over. Immediately, the medicinal cauldron appeared with a bang on the ice before him. Waves of medicinal fragrance instantly spread out and filled the entire cave abode in the glacier. In fact, some of the fragrance even seeped through the ice. Almost at the instant the medicinal fragrance spread out, Su Ming sensed something, and the small snake flew out from his storage bag. It stared at the medicinal cauldron and hissed at Su Ming. At the same time, the turtle on the glacier also widened its eyes. For the first time, its gaze moved away from Su Ming and fell on the medicinal cauldron. As he looked at the medicinal cauldron before him, Su Ming was filled with emotions. He had obtained this cauldron during the auction, and it had been with him for many years. It had also been nourished for 15 years, and in the end, the power of the world had also swiftly surged into it. At that moment, it was finally activated, and the medicinal pill that remained in the cauldron regained its medicinal properties, turning it from an incomplete product to an almost complete one. This medicinal fragrance doesn't seem like the fragrance of a medicinal pill that has been completely refined. There's too much of it spreading out. It's clear that it can't reach completion in the end, but this is the best it can do. Su Ming shook his head, stood up, and went to the side of the medicinal cauldron. He focused his attention on it for a moment, then lifted his right hand resolutely and pressed it against the medicinal cauldron. With it, the medicinal cauldron shuddered, and the lid let out banging sounds. A large amount of white smoke spread out from within the cauldron, and in an instant, the medicinal fragrance became even thicker, causing the small snake to hiss excitedly. The turtle on the ice also stood up and widened its eyes to look at the medicinal cauldron with a curious look on its face. As the white smoke spread out, a frown gradually appeared on Su Ming's face. This was not a good sign. The medicinal fragrance before the lid was opened could still be explained by the fact that it was still lingering in the air, but now that he had opened the lid, such a thick medicinal fragrance could only mean that the medicinal pill inside had melted and had not turned into stone. As the white smoke spread out, the lid of the cauldron was slowly lifted a few breaths later. Once it was completely opened, the insides of the cauldron were revealed. When Su Ming looked inside, his pupils shrank. There was only one medicinal pill in the cauldron, but there was a small puddle of black liquid around the medicinal pill. The thick medicinal fragrance came from that black liquid. Su Ming fell into a moment of pensive silence before he brought out 2 small bottles. He first brought out the only complete medicinal pill and held in his hand to look at it, but it was difficult for him to recognize the effects of the medicinal pill. He did not drink it recklessly. Instead, he placed it in a small bottle, then used another small bottle to pour the black liquid into it. The small snake immediately hissed and wrapped itself around Su Ming's arm. It lifted its head and looked at the small bottle, then at Su Ming, looking as if it wanted to take a bite of the black liquid. This pill is at least something from several hundreds or thousands of years ago. We don't know the specific effects, and you still dare to eat it? Su Ming patted the small snake's lifted head, and his gaze naturally fell on the layer of ice. He widened his eyes and looked at the turtle in the small bottle curiously. A smile appeared on Su Ming's lips. With the small bottle in hand, he returned to the ice mountain for which he had come. He lifted his right hand and jabbed the ice mountain with a finger. Instantly, a crack appeared, and once it pierced through the ice mountain, it turned into a small hole. The turtle roared and turned around to stare at Su Ming. Su Ming first shook the medicinal bottle in his hand before the turtle through the ice mountain, then poured out a drop and flicked it through the small hole. That drop of black medicinal liquid instantly appeared before the turtle and floated there, unmoving. The turtle hesitated for a moment. It first took a few sniffs, and an intoxicated look appeared on its face. It did not see that Su Ming was staring at it intently. The small snake on Su Ming's arm was also looking over with slight nervousness. Clearly, it knew its master's goal. The turtle seemed to be rather hesitant, but in the end, it let out 2 puffs of air from its nose and turned its head away in disdain, no longer looking at the black liquid that was letting out the medicinal fragrance. Su Ming averted his gaze and no longer looked at it. He returned to his cave abode under the ice and cast a few scrutinizing glances at the medicinal bottle before putting it away. Since the turtle did not want to eat it and he could not see its effect for the time being, then he could only search for its effects outside once he left this place. The small snake looked at Su Ming, putting away the medicinal bottle with great reluctance. The medicinal fragrance was incredibly attractive to it, but Su Ming did not want to give it to it, so there was nothing it could do. Su Ming no longer thought about the ancient medicine. He sat down cross-legged and patted his storage bag. Immediately, a flash of purple light appeared. That purple light instantly caught the turtle's attention. However, Su Ming no longer paid any attention to the turtle, which was clearly curious about everything. He looked at the purple armor before him and fell into deep thought. He had obtained this armor from the only person left in the Candle Dragon's body. It was also this person who had spoken about the third god of berserkers. This is definitely not the armor of bone sacrifice. This should be the armor of the divine general in the berserker soul realm, and it's not an illusion like the one I obtained. This is the real armor of the divine general. Su Ming stared at the purple armor, and as his eyes sparkled, he bit the tip of his tongue and coughed out a mouthful of berserker blood. The moment his blood touched the armor, it immediately fused into it. Immediately, the purple armor shone brightly, but very soon, it became dull once again. Su Ming's expression remained as calm as ever, as if he had known this would happen a long time ago. A pensive look appeared in his eyes, and after some time, he opened his mouth and sucked in a breath in the direction of the armor. Immediately, the armor turned into a ray of purple light and shrank rapidly before Su Ming swallowed it. He closed his eyes, and golden light shone within his body. The power of his berserker bones circulated through his entire body and enveloped the purple armor, seeping into it inch by inch, intending to refine it by force and turn it into his own armor. Ever since he obtained this armor, he did not have much time to do this. However, he had plenty of time under the ice, so he made up his mind to turn this armor into his own. At the same time Su Ming closed his eyes to refine the armor, the turtle on the ice turned its head around and cast a sideways glance at the black liquid floating by its side. There was a look of disdain on its face, but before long, it looked at it once again. After struggling for a moment, it opened its mouth and swallowed the black liquid in the midst of its hesitation. It even licked its lips. Where's the rice? Where's the wine? Where's the monthly ticket? Please, please. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 558. Su Ming did not see this, but the small snake saw it clearly. It stared at the turtle with an expectant look on its face. The turtle had an intoxicated look on its face, as if it was very happy. It continued licking its lips, as if it wanted to eat more. This expression made the small snake regard it with hostility when it saw it. 2 months passed by in the blink of an eye. Su Ming's refinement this time had not ended. On the 3rd day after 2 months, his entire body suddenly shone with purple light. As that purple light spread out, a pair of gloves appeared on his hands, followed by the armor on his arms. Then, it spread to his shoulders and turned into 2 ferocious purple beast heads. Finally, it spread to his upper body. A pair of purple eyes on his chest turned into a wolf's head. When the armor spread to Su Ming's head and covered him, he opened his eyes. His eyes were calm, but the purple armor on his body caused his presence to change completely, and he looked to be filled with a strange and evil air. The armor covered the upper half of Su Ming's body, then spread to his legs. Once it covered his entire body, he stood up. As he stood up, a crazed wave of killing intent erupted from his body. That killing intent did not come from Su Ming himself, but from the armor. That killing intent turned into a murderous aura and turned into a layer of purple smoke that surrounded Su Ming's body, causing the small snake to lift its head and retreat into the distance. It also made the turtle on the ice widen its eyes and growl at Su Ming once again. Its expression was incredibly grave, as if it was about to face a great enemy. Su Ming stood there. His hair was originally black outside the armor, but at that moment, under the light from the purple armor, it looked as if it had turned purple. He slowly closed his eyes and did not move, but a huge storm was raging in his heart at that moment, as if thunder was roaring in his head. This armor is not meant for divine generals. The first god of berserkers tore off Tian Xiesheng's skin after he killed him from the other worlds. With starlight as a mark, he refined this armor. The first god of berserkers only refined one of this armor, and the time limit was 500 years. It was buried at the bottom of the abyss in the Great Yu dynasty for 10,000 years to be nourished and used to suppress evil saints' descendants. All those who wore this armor were not bestowed the title of divine general, but the undertaker of evil. To guard the abyss, this armor didn't have any defense, only killing. Using killing to grow stronger. Using killing to become a saint. I'm the 3rd master of this armor, and before I die, if there is a berserker who obtains this armor and can wear it and fuse with its will, then he will become the 4th master of this armor. If one was unwilling to become its master, they could worship and obey its will. After releasing slaughter, they could send it back to the Great Yu dynasty's abyss to prevent the descendants of the evil spirit from creating chaos. With this armor on him, he also has the undertaker of evil spear. This spear was obtained by the first god of berserkers in the world of Nine, and its origins are unknown. However, with the god of berserkers cultivation base, he was unable to use it, so he left it in the abyss under Great Yu as a form of suppression. With the wisdom of the god of berserkers, I used a stone from another world to imitate the undertaker of evil spear. It became the legacy treasure of the undertaker of evil. Su Ming's eyes flew open, and the calmness in his eyes gradually disappeared. It was replaced by a purple glare, and his entire being instantly turned cold. He lifted his right hand and seized the air. The transparent jade slip he had obtained from the candle dragon's body, along with the purple armor, immediately appeared in his hand. He clenched his fist tightly, and due to the transparent jade slip, as the purple light circulated around it, it also started shining with a purple light. That purple light shone in Su Ming's hand and turned into a long purple spear. That spear was 30-something feet long and was much taller than Su Ming's body. However, when he held it in his hands, there was not a single hint of disharmony. Instead, a crazed, murderous aura came crashing into his face, causing terror to appear on the small snake's face as it continuously retreated. Even the turtle outside let out a roar and gradually retreated. Su Ming stood there and lowered his head to look at the long spear in his hand. The murderous aura around his body grew thicker, and he lifted his head slowly to stare at the turtle outside the layer of ice. A wave of madness swiftly rose within him, as if it was about to explode. An evil spirit gradually manifested behind him. It could not be seen clearly, but there was a malicious air about it, and it was filled with madness. It lifted its right hand and pointed at the turtle outside the layer of ice, as if it wanted to control Su Ming to kill it. However, once it lifted its right hand, Su Ming continued standing there and did not move. Instead, he let out a cold harumph, and as he did so, disbelief appeared on the face of the illusory, evil spirit behind him. Its illusory body instantly shattered and disappeared. "You're just a will. How dare you scatter before me?" The purple glare in Su Ming's eyes gradually disappeared to reveal a calm gaze. The long spear in his hand disappeared and turned back into the transparent jade slip. It left Su Ming's hand and floated before him before fusing into the armor on his head. Soon after, the light from the armor on Su Ming's body gradually faded away, and eventually, as if it had melted, it seeped into his body and disappeared without a trace. But this will is pretty good. It actually managed to make me immerse myself in the illusion of slaughter. It's a pity compared to the Candle Dragon's undying and imperishable world. This sort of illusion is insignificant, Su Ming stated flatly. The instant he refined the armor, he sensed the will within it. If it had been him before he entered the Candle Dragon's undying and imperishable world, the impact of this would have been incredibly great. Yet at that moment, it was just as Su Ming had said, it was truly insignificant. Once he put on the armor, not only would he be able to maintain his sanity as the number of people he killed gradually increased, he could also completely suppress the will in the armor and even chase it away. There was no way he would allow other wills to occupy this item that he valued. Perhaps Su Ming's level of cultivation was not the strongest in the land of South Morning, but the strength of his will was so great that it could be said that it could not be destroyed in the entire land of berserkers and even the land of immortals. Besides himself, the main reason for all of this was because of the endless cycles of reincarnation in the undying and imperishable world. Once the armor was put away, the small snake's expression slowly turned gentle. It quickly flew to Su Ming's side and started hissing. The turtle's expression also relaxed on the ice, but its gaze when it looked at Su Ming was still filled with wariness. Su Ming patted the small snake's head. With the connection between them, even if he could not understand the meaning behind its hissing, he could still sense it. At that moment, he lifted his head and cast a glance at the turtle on the ice. Once he noticed that the drop of black liquid had disappeared, Su Ming fell into a moment of pensive silence. When he saw the small snake looking at him expectantly, he laughed and brought out the small bottle filled with black liquid before pouring out a drop. The moment that drop of liquid appeared, the wariness in the turtle's eyes immediately disappeared and was replaced by desire. It lowered its head and stared at the black liquid. When it saw the small snake that had been hostile towards it swallowing the black liquid in one gulp, the turtle immediately roared in anger and started scratching the ice with its claws like a puppy. Then it panted in anger, and a strong desire gradually appeared on its face. However, when it saw the small snake looking as if it wanted more after swallowing that drop, and when it saw Su Ming, the person it hated the most since the beginning, actually bringing out another drop, the turtle was completely enraged. It slammed its gigantic body against the ground and roared in anger, swinging its tail back and forth. When Su Ming saw this, a thought appeared in his head, and he sent a thought to the small snake. Immediately, the small snake that had swallowed the 2 drops of black liquid flew back into Su Ming's storage bag, and when it flew out again after a moment, it charged towards the edge of the cave abode in the ice. This strange action immediately caught the turtle's attention. Right before its eyes, the The small snake circled the ice cave a few times, and for some unknown reason, a small sword appeared in its mouth, which it handed to Su Ming. It also saw the person it had previously hated patting the small snake's head and bringing out another drop of black liquid. The turtle let out a few furious roars and glared at the small snake and the black liquid. It turned around and charged into the distance, disappearing from the ice in the blink of an eye. Su Ming blinked. He waited for a moment, but the turtle still did not return. He wondered if this incredibly curious turtle with low intelligence did not understand the meaning behind his words. He waited for another day, but the turtle still did not return. Su Ming no longer thought about it. Instead, he sat down cross-legged and brought out a ring-shaped, enchanted vessel with a grave expression. That enchanted vessel was huge and occupied a small part of the cave abode in the ice. This enchanted vessel was used to cut crimson stones. God ascension nectar. Just what sort of serendipity is this? Su Ming mumbled. As he lifted his right hand, a crimson stone appeared before him. That crimson stone contained a purple poisonous wasp within it. There were plenty of crimson stones in Su Ming's storage bag, but he never had enough time to open them one by one. Now that he was hiding from the change in South Morning and was in this frozen world, he had enough time to open these crimson stones one by one. Besides, no matter what sort of valuable herbs or items he found in this place, no one would covet them or fight over them. The one Su Ming longed to cut open the most was the stone before him. He wanted to know whether there was God Ascension nectar in this poisonous wasp's body. This wasp still has a sliver of life left. It's not dead. Su Ming remained silent for a moment before he stood up and swung his arm. Immediately, the crimson stone flew into the ring-shaped enchanted vessel. He stood beside the enchanted vessel and pressed his right hand on it. Once he got used to it, he found the feeling he had when he cut the stone in the past and started cutting it slowly. Rustling sounds reverberated in the air. This crimson stone that had not been completely cut in the past and could not be considered to have been revealed to the world was rapidly shrinking. Eventually, as the ring-shaped enchanted vessel rubbed against it, it turned into a stone the size of a head. Su Ming's expression was grave as he continued cutting it slowly. When he reached the crimson stone, a glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes. He saw a purple poisonous wasp under the thin layer of stone. That wasp looked ferocious, and even though it was sealed in the stone, it gave off a feeling that it was as if it was alive. In truth, there was indeed a hint of life left in it. Su Ming stared at the poisonous wasp in the semi-transparent crimson stone and sucked in a deep breath. He lifted his right hand and swung it forward. Immediately, the poisoned corpse appeared by his side, along with the small snake. Once Su Ming made preparations for any accidents, he was just about to cut the stone when suddenly a violent tremor came from the layer of ice. Su Ming frowned and lifted his head to look upwards. That one glance caused his mouth to fall open, and he was momentarily stunned. He saw the turtle running towards him, and I've sent all 4 chapters to you, and I'll add more tomorrow. I'm sincerely begging for monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 559. When the monthly votes were doubled, Jin actually liked to read the individual votes of heroes from all over the world, how to express one's infinite desire in a limited number of words, how to get a large number of votes from the army of people who were fighting for the monthly votes. This was a skill. This skill was very useful. For example, a house seller needed to get people to buy a house. A car seller needed to get people to buy a car. A shop owner needed to get people to shop. A business owner needed to get people to sign a contract. And a salesman needed to get people to approve. Another example was how to borrow money from girls when I was in school, and how to borrow money for boys. The latter was more difficult. All of these were inseparable from this skill. I wanted to become a master of this skill because I could do well even if I didn't write books. Unfortunately, I'm still a dabbler. I could only sigh with emotion, "Monthly votes, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you moving? Why aren't you moving? You have to be strong. You have to hold on. don't lurk, it's time to come out. To be continued. If you like this work, please come Achidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 560. There were also broken iron swords, broken shields, and many shattered objects outside the tortoise's body that seemed to have been attracted by it. There were so many things that one couldn't even make out their original shapes. At first glance, one would be dazzled by these things. There were so many of them that one couldn't even make out their original shapes. Yet when they looked at them the second time, they would not know whether to laugh or cry bitterly, because all of these items were trash. Some of them even had pieces of ice on them. Clearly, the turtle had just dug them out from the layer of ice. The turtle ran over quickly like a puppy. Once it returned to the ice right above Su Ming's cave abode, it came to a halt, but the scattered items around its body did not stop. Instead, they fell straight onto the ice before it. Crashing sounds reverberated in the air, and once they pushed aside a small hill, the turtle cast a smug look at the small snake, then looked at Su Ming eagerly and licked its lips. Su Ming looked at the scattered shards, then at the turtle, who had a smug look on his face and even looked incredibly honest. With a wry smile, he lifted his right hand and swung in the air. The medicinal bottle containing the black liquid appeared on his palm. The moment Su Ming brought out the bottle, the small snake immediately lifted its head towards him, and desire appeared on its face. As for the turtle outside the layer of ice, it widened its eyes and gasped harshly through its nostrils. It instinctively scratched at the ice with its front claws. After a moment of pensive silence, Su Ming did not want to dispel the turtle's enthusiasm just like that. Hence, he poured out a drop of black liquid, and once he cast a glance at the turtle, he took away most of that drop of black liquid. When there was only a sliver left, he frowned, and a displeased look appeared on his face. He brought that sliver of black liquid to the ice mountain, and once he opened up another small hole, he flicked it out. The turtle opened its mouth wide and immediately pounced on Su Ming to swallow that sliver of black liquid. An intoxicated look appeared on its face, but after waiting for some time, when it saw that Su Ming was no longer giving it the black liquid and had instead left to return to the ice cave below, it let out a few displeased roars and even went up to fiddle with the abandoned hill it had pushed aside. When it saw that Su Ming was still ignoring it, the turtle became even more enraged. It roared and paced back and forth a few times on the ice. Then, as if it had thought of something, it flew up once again and disappeared into the darkness. Once the turtle left, Su Ming calmed himself down and stood beside the ring-shaped enchanted vessel. He looked at the poisonous wasp in the semi-transparent mountain rock within the enchanted vessel. He stared at the mountain for a moment before a resolute look appeared on his face. He lifted his right hand and pressed it on the enchanted vessel. Immediately, the enchanted light ring flew towards him with a buzzing sound. As it slowly rubbed against the semi-transparent mountain rock, it gradually became smaller and thinner. Eventually, after a moment, the transparent mountain rock let out a cracking sound and completely shattered before Su Ming. At the instant it turned into ashes, Su Ming stretched out his right hand like lightning. Golden light shone at his fingertips and turned into a cyclone. Once it fused with the golden light, it surrounded the poisonous wasp in multiple layers and trapped it between his fingers. Su Ming's heart pounded against his chest. Did this poisonous wasp have any nectar in its body? If it didn't, then all his hopes would go up in smoke. If it did have nectar, then could this nectar be the god ascension flower? If it didn't, then all his hopes would go up in smoke. When he remembered how the people in Shaman City had been so fervent and talked about the god ascension nectar in the past, and when he thought about this strange god ascension flower that was almost extinct and might not even belong to this place or true Morning Tao world, but came from true Sacredine world or even the universe's universe, when he thought about its shocking effects, there was no way Su Ming would not be nervous. As he worried about his gains and losses, Su Ming looked at the poisonous wasp surrounded and sealed by the golden vortex between his fingers, and his eyes shone like lightning. The god ascension flower was a legendary item. Its rarity was indescribable. In fact, it could be said that there was not a single remnant of it left in the entire Berserker's continent. Its nectar was even rarer. After all, only when the flower bloomed would nectar appear. Right now, the god Ascension flower was practically a legend. So how could he possibly have its nectar? As he stared at the poisonous wasp between his fingers, Su Ming spread his divine sense outwards and fused it into the creature's body. However, the moment he touched it, he immediately had a strong feeling that the poisonous wasp had been asleep for a long time. It might still have a hint of life in it, but if he forced his divine sense into it to check, the wasp would immediately die. If it truly had God Ascension nectar in its body, would it be affected or would it disappear? Su Ming did not want to take this risk. The simplest way is to swallow this poisonous wasp and meld it completely. But this wasp is an insect that can harvest God Ascension nectar, so its poison is definitely not weak. If I swallow it, Su Ming's eyes sparkled as he stared at the poisonous needle at the wasp's tail. After a moment of pensive silence, Su Ming did not act rashly. Instead, he acted according to his initial plan. He turned his divine sense into a brand and slowly seeped it into the poisonous wasp's body. Only by turning this creature into my pet will I be able to make it obediently spit out the nectar. This way, the nectar I'll obtain will be the most reliable and complete. God Ascension nectar was simply too rare, and Su Ming could not afford to make even the slightest mistake. He stared at the sleeping poisonous wasp before him and slowly left his brand on it. However, this was definitely not something that could be done within a short period of time. After a moment, Su Ming placed the poisonous wasp into a jade box and put it away into his storage bag. He still had a wisp of his divine sense spread out to surround the jade box as he continued branding it. If God Ascension nectar really exists, then once I completely brand this poisonous wasp with my divine sense and turn it into my pet, I'll have my answers. Su Ming quelled the anticipation in his heart and brought out another crimson stone to continue cutting into it in the frozen land at the bottom of the sea. This sort of cutting was incredibly dull, but Su Ming was already used to being alone. Was there any loneliness that could compare to the endless cycles of life and death in the undying and imperishable world? Just like that, Su Ming stayed in the frozen world. Time trickled by, and in the blink of an eye, a year went by. During this year, the turtle returned several times, and each time it returned, it would bring back a large amount of items. It was a pity that not a single one of them was complete. They were all broken items, causing several small hills to form on the layer of ice. The cave abode under the layer of ice where Su Ming was had also become much larger than it was a year ago. This was all thanks to the poison corpse and the small snake. As they continued expanding the cave abode in the ice was gradually no longer as simple as it used to be. It had become much larger, and there were even a few ice chambers that were separated into it. Besides the small snake and the poison corpse, there were two other floating souls in the frozen cave abode. One of them was a woman, and that soul was naturally the celestial maiden. She had been taken out by Su Ming half a year ago, and since then, she had been staying by his side and watching him. The other floating soul was Ahu. He was floating around the area in a daze, pacing back and forth. All the crimson stones had been cut open by Su Ming during the year. He had personally chosen each of them in the past, and all of them contained either medicinal herbs or items, causing Su Ming's storage bag to be filled with an endless amount of items. If he brought any one of them out, it was highly likely that he would stir up an uproar and fight over them. In fact, there were even some whose names Su Ming did not know. He was prepared to search for the effects of these plants once he left this place. A year passed by just like that. Su Ming would occasionally open his eyes from his meditation and look at the area beyond the layer of ice. He did not know how the land of South Morning was doing after the catastrophe of the eastern wastelands. After a long while, he averted his gaze quietly. At that moment, after meditating for a period of time, his power had reached its peak, and he was about to do something else. He had been waiting for a long time, and now he had finally managed to gather the complete main ingredient for the quenching stone. The welcoming of deities. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he cast a glance at the medicinal cauldron not too far away from him. That cauldron was now exuding a freezing aura, and there were layers of frost around it, as if it had been sealed in ice. He lifted his right hand, and the lid of the medicinal cauldron immediately flew open. With a swing of his arm, a black shadow flew out from his storage bag. Right at the moment it flew out, a brilliant glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he pointed at the black shadow with his right hand, which he had just swung out. That black shadow revealed itself at that moment, and it was a spider's leg. Once Su Ming pointed at it, it immediately disintegrated. When it turned into powder, Su Ming bit the tip of his tongue and coughed out a mouthful of berserker blood. The blood swept up the shattered spider leg and flew into the medicinal cauldron. Once it did so, a grave look appeared on Su Ming's face. He patted his storage bag, and another item immediately flew out. The moment it appeared, the small snake by his side immediately lifted its head, and a complicated look appeared on its face. That item was the candle dragon scale. As Su Ming looked at the scale before him, he waved his hand, and that item flew into the medicinal cauldron. The final main ingredient. Su Ming lowered his head, and a dark light spread out from his storage bag. Slowly, a semi-transparent mountain rock manifested before him. There was a small, black humanoid sitting cross-legged in the mountain rock. It had its eyes closed and did not move. Su Ming looked at the small, black humanoid in the mountain rock, and his gaze fell on the third finger on the small humanoid's right hand. He remained silent for a moment before he suddenly spoke. "I know that you have intelligence and can understand my words." The small, black humanoid in the mountain rock did not move, as if it was in deep sleep. It did not seem to have heard Su Ming's words. "There might be a lot of secrets on you, and even if your arrival here has nothing to do with the true Sacredine world, it is definitely related to the spirits of Nine Yin's mission. I'm not interested in knowing about these things now. Since I gain a lot from the Crimson Stones, thanks to your help, I only need the third finger on your right hand, and I won't make things difficult for you anymore," Su Ming stated calmly. However, the small, black humanoid in the mountain rock continued sleeping as if it did not hear him. "I'll give you the span of 10 breaths to think about it. If you don't give me an answer after 10 breaths, I'll forcefully take your finger." Once Su Ming finished speaking, he no longer spoke. Time passed by, and when the 9th breath arrived, the small, black humanoid's eyelashes fluttered, and it slowly opened its eyes to look at Su Ming with a complicated expression. "I'll give you my third finger. Will you let me go?" The small, black humanoid looked at Su Ming and spoke hoarsely after a long while. There was a hint of a piercing tone to its voice that shot through the mountain rock and echoed in Su Ming's ears. "I won't." Su Ming looked at the small, black humanoid and spoke flatly with a calm expression on his face. "The first chapter is here. Do you still have your monthly votes? To be continued. If you like this work, then please come to Start Point and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 561. If you don't, then what right do you have to make me give you the third finger on my right hand? The small black humanoid stared at Su Ming, and its voice became even sharper. "Because you only managed to wake up 15 years ago after you followed me." Su Ming's expression remained calm as he looked at the small black humanoid and spoke languidly. 15 years ago, with the small black humanoid's help, Su Ming had been able to sense the Crimson Stones. He had been rather puzzled about this, but due to his level of cultivation, he could not see through it. 15 years later, when he walked out of the undying and imperishable world and obtained the Candle Dragon's blessing, Su Ming's level of cultivation increased by a large margin. When he observed the small black humanoid once again, he found some clues with just one glance. There might still be aura of death in the small humanoid's body, but that aura was to hide that extra hint of life force. It knew how to hide that life force. And when Su Ming remembered what had happened 15 years ago, he was 8/10 certain that the small black humanoid had been asleep the first time he obtained it. Perhaps it had only woken up 15 years ago because of the stimulation from the Crimson Stones. Or else, if it had woken up a long time ago, it would not have been auctioned off. With just a brief analysis, Su Ming could guess that while the small humanoid had woken up, it could not escape from the candle dragon's body due to Su Ming's petrification. Once the petrification was over and Su Ming's level of cultivation had increased by leaps and bounds, it must have decided that it did not dare to escape. Perhaps it had originally wanted to search for a chance, but that chance never appeared. The small black humanoid fell silent in the face of Su Ming's calm words. Su Ming was patient enough. He sat down cross-legged and did not speak. After a moment, a glint appeared in the small black humanoid's eyes, and it looked towards Su Ming. Perhaps we can make a deal. Do you want to leave this place? I'm talking about in Death Region. The third finger. Su Ming's expression did not change as he spoke languidly. The small black humanoid hesitated for a moment before it lifted its right hand from the mountain rock. A complicated look appeared on its face, but in the end, a resolute look appeared on its face. It bit down on the third finger, spat it out, and once it held it in its hand, it cast some unknown divine ability and threw it. The third finger instantly shot through the mountain rock and landed before Su Ming. At the instant Su Ming lifted his right hand to seize that finger, it immediately turned into black fog with a bang. A ghastly mouth appeared within it, and it swallowed Su Ming's right hand. Su Ming's divine sense remained calm. He did not dodge and simply allowed the mouth that was formed by the black fog to swallow his palm. Days passed by, and when the welcoming of deities was created for the 998th day, perhaps it was because this place was isolated from the world, the heavenly disaster did not arrive. On the 999th day, booming sounds came from the medicinal cauldron before Su Ming, and there were also numerous sounds that sounded like mumbling spreading out from within the medicinal cauldron. The instant Su Ming opened his eyes, the lid of the medicinal cauldron flew off, and a ray of strange light instantly flew out. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes, and he warped to walk out from the layer of ice at the top of the cave abode. He lifted his right hand and seized the incoming ray of light. The ray of light was just about to dodge, but once Su Ming let out a cold harumph, a wave of ripples appeared in the air above the cave abode. That ripple spread out and looked as if space itself had frozen, causing the ray of light to freeze for a moment. During that instant, Su Ming grabbed the ray of light with his right hand. The instant he touched it, the light disappeared, and a purplish-red medicinal core appeared in Su Ming's hand. A human face that was exactly the same as Su Ming's appeared on the medicinal core, and it was staring at him while letting out low growls. The welcoming of deities possesses the power to destroy the world. It can manifest into tens of thousands of things, and it can contain the souls and will within it. It can also absorb the broken spirits in the world and have them descend on its body to be used by the Creator. If you devour it, you can turn it into the body of the broken souls it absorbs into your body. The wind and clouds will reverse, and you can shake the heavens. This was the introduction to the medicinal effects of the welcoming of deities once Su Ming obtained the method to create the pill. At that time, he had been rather unclear about this, but now Su Ming could already see the true use of this medicinal core. It was just as the saying had said, the welcoming of deities was divided into the inner and outer parts. The inner part contained the nascent divinity, and it could change into a body as if it was a clone. The outer part could sense the broken souls in the world and forcefully absorb them. Once it swallowed the pill, it could turn into a broken soul, and with its own will, it could bring forth the power of the broken soul. The strength of that power would depend on the number of broken souls it absorbed. If it absorbed the candle dragon's broken soul, Su Ming held the one and only welcoming of deities he had created, and as his eyes sparkled, he stared at it. The welcoming of deities. A glint appeared in Su Ming's eyes as he fell into pensive silence. The immortal's nascent divinity in his body spread out and charged towards the welcoming of deities. Once it fused into the pill, it flew out of Su Ming's hand, and as dark light shone in midair, it gradually turned into a teenager. That teenager's appearance was that of Su Ming's in the past. I still need to find the broken souls of powerful spirits. It's a pity I didn't have this pill when I ran into the Candle Dragon, or else, if I took in the Candle Dragon's broken soul and swallowed this medicinal core, then based on its effects, I could turn into the Candle Dragon. Su Ming's eyes sparkled and his heart raced. I wonder if this pill is an exaggeration. Su Ming cast a glance at his past self, and with a single thought, dark light immediately shone on the teenager's body. His nascent divinity returned to his body, and as that dark light gathered together, it turned back into the medicinal core. Once Su Ming put it away into his storage bag, he lifted his head and cast a glance at the darkness beyond the ice. It's been almost 4 years. As I've been training during these 4 years, the berserker bones in my body have improved slightly. Now, nearly a seventh of them have all turned into berserker bones. It's time for me to leave. The clash between South Morning and Eastern Wastelands should also end. The ninth summit appeared before Su Ming's eyes. After a long while, he closed his eyes, and when he reopened them, he had tidied up the cave abode he had stayed in for almost 4 years. He put away the medicinal cauldron and the poisoned corpse, as well as the celestial maiden and Ahu's souls. Once he put away the small snake on his shoulder, Su Ming went to the ice mountain at the exit of the cave abode. He looked at the relocation gate in the ice mountain and was just about to leave. Suddenly, a low roar came from beyond the layer of ice. When Su Ming lifted his head to look, a smile appeared at the corners of his lips. The turtle was charging towards him from the dark seawater with a huge object in its mouth. That object looked to be several hundreds of feet long and could not be seen clearly. The turtle brought it to the layer of ice, and once it saw Su Ming, the turtle immediately let go and looked at him with eager anticipation. It even used its claws to push the object it had brought with it. Su Ming stared at the turtle, then turned around with a smile. He pressed his right hand on the layer of ice, and cracking sounds reverberated in the air. When the turtle blinked, the layer of ice that had existed between them for the past 4 years shattered, and Su Ming walked out. The turtle did not show the ferocious look it had in the past. Instead, the anticipation on its face grew stronger, and it even took a few steps forward to get closer to Su Ming. Su Ming did not avoid it. He simply allowed the turtle to get closer to him. He looked at it, and a smile appeared in his eyes. He did not look at the object it had brought over, but instead brought out the small bottle containing the black liquid and poured out 8 drops. I'll give you these 8 drops. I don't have much left. I'll have to save some for the small snake. I'll be leaving today. I wonder whether this relocation gate can last until I come again. Su Ming patted the turtle's head with his right hand. The creature moved back a little, but once it cast a glance at the 8 drops of black liquid, it simply allowed Su Ming to pat its head. I'm leaving. Su Ming looked at the turtle and averted his gaze. Just as he was about to leave, the turtle stuck out its tongue, and right under the small snake's jealous gaze, it swallowed all 8 drops of black liquid with an intoxicated look on its face. When it saw that Su Ming was about to leave, it quickly used its claws to push the item it had brought over a few more times. Su Ming instinctively looked at it. It was still a broken item. It looked like it was left behind after some palace collapsed and was connected to a sign. It was covered in crushed ice, and there were even some indistinct words written on it. Su Ming crouched down and wiped off the ice on the broken sign before looking at the indistinct words on it. Yet the instant he saw it, a shudder ran through his body. A bang went off in his head, and a dazed look appeared on his face. Great you heavenly palace. These 4 large characters were carved on the dilapidated signboard. The second update is here. It is the last 2 days of the month. Please support me with monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. That you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.